Before we dive into today's journey, have you ever experienced something strange while out camping? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build this haven of eerie campfire tales together. In the heart of the dense Pacific Northwest forest, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, I was tracking an elusive buck. My name is Clifford Brennan, and I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. Today, however, felt different. I had faced just about every possible hardship thrown at me, but none of them had prepared me for what I was about to face. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. I moved carefully, stepping over roots and rocks, trying to make as little noise as possible. I had my Remington 700 with me, a trusty rifle that had seen many hunts. The buck's tracks were fresh, and I was sure I was getting closer. A sudden stillness fell over the forest. The birds stopped singing, and the usual background hum of the forest seemed to vanish. I paused, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I pressed on, brushing off the unease. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where the trees were thicker and the light barely penetrated. I glanced at my watch. It was just past noon, but the darkness made it feel much later. As I moved farther, I noticed something odd. The tracks had changed. They were no longer neat prints of a buck. They were deeper, wider, and there were more of them, as if something heavy had been dragged through the forest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the tracks. They led me to a small clearing, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The ground was disturbed with patches of grass torn up and scattered around. In the center of the clearing was a large, bloody mess, what looked like the remains of a deer. But it wasn't just the sight of the carcass that unnerved me. It was the sheer violence of the scene. The deer had been mauled, its body torn apart as if by some monstrous force. I scanned the area, rifle at the ready. That's when I heard it, a low guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. I couldn't see the source of the noise, but I could feel it. A presence watching me from the shadows. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt like lead. Slowly, I backed away from the clearing, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Suddenly, a movement to my left caught my eye. I spun around, raising my rifle, but there was nothing there. Just the dense underbrush and the towering trees. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, to get away from whatever was out there. I retraced my steps, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The forest was eerily silent now, the oppressive silence only broken by my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. As I neared the edge of the forest, I heard the sound again, closer this time. It was a wet, slurping noise, followed by a low, rumbling growl. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted towards the safety of the open fields. I burst out of the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, parked at the edge of the forest. I threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine started. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest. The trees loomed dark and menacing, and I could almost feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I never wanted to encounter it again. When I got home, I called my friend Kurt. He was a retired forest ranger and knew these woods better than anyone. If anyone could make sense of what I'd seen, it was him. Kurt listened patiently as I recounted my experience, his face growing more serious with every word. "Cliff, it sounds like you stumbled upon something you weren't supposed to," he said, his voice grave. "There are stories about these woods, old legends about creatures that don't belong in our world. Most people dismiss them as folklore, but there are those who believe." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "You think I saw a ghost?" Kurt shook his head. "Not a ghost, something worse, something ancient." The days passed, but I couldn't get the incident out of my mind. I found myself drawn back to the forest despite the terror it held. I needed answers, even if I didn't want to admit it. A week later, armed with more supplies and a renewed determination, I ventured back into the forest. This time, I wasn't alone. Kurt had agreed to come with me, and he brought along his own rifle and a pack filled with survival gear. We retraced my steps, moving cautiously through the forest. The atmosphere was just as oppressive as before, but having Kurt with me gave me some comfort. As we approached the clearing, I felt the same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The clearing was just as I remembered, the disturbed ground, the remains of the deer. Kurt examined the scene, his expression grim. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." "Bad? What do you think did this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's not something we can fight with bullets." We moved farther into the forest, following the tracks. They led us to a cave partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The entrance was dark, and a foul smell emanated from within. Kurt and I exchanged a glance. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. He nodded. "If we're going to find answers, it's in there." We entered the cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell grew stronger, almost overwhelming. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that looked ancient and unsettling. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder. Our breath fogged in the flashlight beams, and the feeling of being watched intensified. We rounded a corner and came face to face with our worst nightmare. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen. It stood on two legs, its body covered in matted fur. Its hands were clawed, and its face was a grotesque combination of human and beast. It stared at us with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark, a low rumble emanating from its chest. Before we could react, it lunged at us. Kurt fired his rifle, the shot echoing through the cave, but it didn't stop the creature. It swiped at him, knocking him to the ground. I fired my own rifle, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. In the chaos, I grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it at the creature. It hit the beast square in the head, and it staggered back, momentarily dazed. I took the opportunity to help Kurt to his feet, and we ran, not daring to look back. We emerged from the cave, gasping for breath. Kurt was injured, but alive. We made our way back to the truck as quickly as possible. The forest once again fell silent around us. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. Kurt broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said. "No one will believe us." I nodded in agreement. "What do we do now?" "We stay away from the forest," he replied, "and we hope that thing never finds its way out." We never went back to the forest after that. The memory of what we saw still haunts me, but I try not to think about it too much. Life goes on, and I have to believe that some things are better left unknown. The forest remains a dark and mysterious place, hiding secrets that are best left undisturbed. Somewhere within its depths, the creature lurks, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into its domain. My name is Gabriel Martinelli, and I was 41 years old when this happened in the summer of 2023. After retiring from the military, I spent most of my days traveling the country in my RV, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or just a sense of purpose. I'd spent decades in combat zones, surrounded by noise and chaos, and I thought the wilderness might silence the ghosts in my head. That's what brought me to the Laurel Fork Wilderness in West Virginia. I'd heard about the area from a fellow camper, a secluded stretch of forest untouched and serene, perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. I didn't know then about the stories surrounding Devil's Hollow or the witch that locals claimed cursed the land. If I had, I might have gone somewhere else, or maybe not. The first day was uneventful. The road to my chosen campsite was narrow and bumpy, the kind of terrain that tested your patience and your vehicle. My RV wasn't new, but it had served me well over the years. Still, it groaned and sputtered as I navigated the steep incline toward the hollow. About a mile from my intended spot, the engine stalled. I cursed under my breath, turning the key repeatedly, but all I got was the tired whine of a machine that had had enough. I grabbed my tools, hoping it was something simple, but as the hours dragged on, it became clear that I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "Well," I muttered, wiping grease from my hands. "Guess this is home for now." I set up camp just off the road, close enough to the hollow to feel its presence, but far enough to keep my distance. The air was cooler here, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just the terrain, the dense canopy blocking out the sun, but there was something else too. a heaviness I couldn't explain. The first night I slept poorly. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and rustle. I'd spent enough time in the wild to know the sounds of nocturnal animals, but this was different. There were no owls, no crickets, nothing but the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. At some point I thought I heard something outside the RV, a faint scratching like claws against metal. I froze, listening, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. When I finally worked up the nerve to look, flashlight in hand, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees. I told myself it was the wind and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning I found the dead birds. They were arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet from my RV, their feathers ruffled but otherwise untouched. There were no signs of an attack, no blood, just 7 small bodies, their lifeless eyes staring up at the canopy. My stomach churned as I stood over them, trying to make sense of it. Predators don't do this. Even kids pulling pranks wouldn't bother hiking this far out. I buried them, more out of respect than anything else, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, the trails barely more than animal paths winding through the underbrush. About a mile in, I found the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a jagged spiral surrounded by smaller runes I didn't recognize. The cuts were fresh, the edges of the bark still raw. My first thought was kids again, but the precision of the carvings made me second guess. This wasn't random graffiti. It meant something, though I didn't know what. That night, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the hollow, rain hammering against the roof of the RV. I huddled inside, reading by flashlight, the sound of the storm oddly comforting. It drowned out the silence, the oppressive weight of the forest, but then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it curled around the trees, carrying the echoes of distant sounds. But as I listened, the whispers grew more distinct, more deliberate. They weren't words exactly, but they carried intent, a low, murmuring chant that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, burying my head in my book, but the sound burrowed into my mind. It felt like it was coming from inside the RV, pressing against my skull. And then I saw her. She stood just outside the window, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. A cloaked figure, her face hidden in the shadows of her hood. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her presence was suffocating. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, but by the time I stepped outside, she was gone. The next day, I found the grave marker. It was tucked deep within the hollow, a small stone slab half buried in moss and dirt. The name was barely legible, worn down by centuries of weather. Margaret Ellis. Beside it, I found a charred leather diary, its pages brittle and stained. I flipped through it carefully, piecing together fragments of Margaret's story. She wasn't a witch, not in the way the legends claimed. She'd been a healer, accused by her neighbors when a plague swept through the settlement. They blamed her for the deaths, dragging her into the hollow and burning her at the stake. Her final entry was a curse, scrawled in trembling handwriting. To those who condemned me, I curse this hollow with my dying breath. May your bloodline suffer as I have suffered, and may no soul find peace in this cursed place. That night was the worst. The storm returned, fiercer than before, and the whispers gave way to screams. They were everywhere, echoing off the walls of the RV, filling every corner with their anguish. The cloaked figure appeared again, closer this time. She stood in the middle of the clearing, her hood pulled back to reveal a face that was both beautiful and grotesque, her eyes burning like embers. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice a low growl that vibrated in my chest. My throat tightened, the words catching like barbed wire. I didn't know. Her expression twisted into a sneer. They never know. She raised a hand and the world tilted. I fell to my knees, my vision blurring as memories flooded my mind. Moments I'd tried so hard to forget. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of my comrades, the smell of blood and burning sand. "Stop!" I shouted, clutching my head. "Please, stop!" The screams faded, replaced by her laughter. "You carry death with you, soldier," she said. "Why should I spare you?" Desperate, I fumbled for my dog tags, ripping them from my neck. "I'm sorry," I choked out, holding them up. "For whatever they did to you, I'm sorry." Her laughter stopped. She stared at the tags, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand. The The storm ceased, the whispers faded, and she was gone. The next morning, I left the hollow. My RV started without a hitch, as if the past few days had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as I drove down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Ellis was watching me, her presence lingering in the shadows. I don't know if I appeased her or if she simply let me go. But I do know one thing. There are places in this world that remember the horrors done to them. Places that hold grudges. And Devil's Hollow is one of them. My name is Alexandra Daddario, and I'm 27 years old. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that paranormal nonsense, or at least I didn't. What happened to me and Claire last summer on Bell Mountain changed everything. It started as a romantic getaway, just the two of us, a tent and some hiking trails in the middle of the Missouri wilderness. It ended with us running for our lives. This happened in July of last year in one of Claire's adventure phases. Claire, my girlfriend, is 26 and obsessed with hiking, folklore, and anything remotely spooky. I'm the opposite, a city guy who likes cold beers, reliable Wi-Fi, and not being chased by the unknown. When she suggested we spend a weekend camping near the summit of Bell Mountain, I reluctantly agreed. She said it would be fun, a way to escape the noise of everyday life. I didn't realize the noise we were escaping would be replaced by something far worse. We arrived late in the afternoon, the summer sun hanging low as we parked our RV at the trailhead. Claire was already buzzing with excitement. "This place is supposed to be haunted, you know," she said as we unpacked our gear. "Perfect," I muttered, rolling my eyes. "Exactly what I want on a weekend off. Ghost stories and mosquito bites." "Oh, come on, Alex. The legend of the Bell Mountain Witch is fascinating," she said. "Supposedly, she cursed this area centuries ago after being accused of witchcraft. They say she still haunts the mountain, marking her victims with strange symbols." Yeah, I replied, hoisting my backpack. "Let's just find the campsite." We followed the trail up the mountain, the air growing cooler as the sun dipped behind the trees. Claire walked ahead, her ponytail swinging as she chatted about the witch and her curse. I tried to focus on the trail, not the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my annoyance with the hike, or maybe the eerie silence of the forest. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. About a mile in, we stumbled across something odd. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a pyramid shape. "Look at this," Claire said, crouching beside it. "It's just a cairn," I said. "Probably left by hikers." "Not like this," she said, pointing at the rocks. Each one was etched with faint, weathered symbols, circles, triangles, and other geometric shapes. "These look like runes," I shrugged. "Hikers with too much time on their hands." Claire took a picture with her phone before we moved on. I didn't say it out loud, but the sight of those symbols made my stomach twist. Something about them felt wrong. We reached the clearing near sunset and set up our tent. It was a beautiful spot with a view of the valley below and the silhouette of the mountain against the fiery sky. For a moment, I felt a little more at ease. Claire was in her element, unpacking her gear and snapping photos of the scenery. "I read there's an old homestead about half a mile from here," she said, pulling out her map. "We should check it out before it gets dark." I sighed. "Claire, can't we just relax? We've been hiking all day." "It'll be quick," she said, flashing me a smile. "I promise." Reluctantly, I followed her through the woods, using the fading light to guide us. The cabin appeared suddenly, a crumbling structure hidden among the trees. Its wooden frame was sagging, the roof caved in, and vines snaked through the broken windows. Claire's eyes lit up. "This must be it," she said, stepping inside the foundation. I hesitated at the doorway. The air inside was heavy and musty. Claire crouched near a pile of rubble and picked up something small and rusted. "Look at this," she said, holding up a jagged piece of metal shaped like an eye. "It's an amulet." "It's junk," I said. "Come on, let's go." But Claire slipped the amulet into her pocket, ignoring my protests. "It's probably part of the legend," she said. "It's a piece of history." I didn't argue, I just wanted to get back to the tent. That night, as we sat by the fire, the forest came alive with sounds I couldn't explain. At first, it was soft whispers that seemed to drift through the trees. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, but there was nothing there. You heard that right? I asked Claire. She nodded, her face pale. Maybe it's an animal. An animal that knows how to walk in circles? I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We climbed into the tent, zipping it tight and turning off the lantern. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds outside. At some point, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a high-pitched scream that echoed through the valley. I sat up, heart pounding, but Claire was still asleep, clutching the amulet. The next morning, things got worse. My phone was dead, and our GPS watch wouldn't work. Even the compass in my backpack spun uselessly. Something's messing with us, I said, pacing the campsite. Claire shrugged. It's probably just interference, or a battery issue. Claire, everything's broken. That's not normal. She waved me off and suggested we hike to the summit, but I refused. We need to leave, I said firmly. Claire argued, but I was firm. We packed up and started back down the trail, except the trail was gone. The path we had taken the day before was unrecognizable, replaced by dense trees and more of those strange cairns. We're lost, I said, panic creeping into my voice. We can't be, Claire said, frowning at the map. But the map made no sense either. It was as if the mountain had rearranged itself overnight. As we wandered, I noticed Claire was acting odd. She muttered to herself, her eyes distant and her movements sluggish. I tried to snap her out of it, but she just shook her head and kept walking. By the time night fell, we were back at the clearing where we had started, exhausted. We set up camp again. I tried to light a fire, but the wood wouldn't catch. Claire sat silently, staring at the amulet in her hand. You need to get rid of that thing, I said. No, she said, her voice low and flat. It's mine. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers returned, louder this time, joined by faint laughter. The tent bulged outward as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I held my breath, clutching a pocket knife, and waited for dawn. The next day, Claire was worse. She didn't speak, didn't eat, and didn't seem to care about finding the trail. When I tried to take the amulet from her, she shoved me so hard I fell to the ground. Her strength was unnatural, and her eyes, they weren't human anymore. They were cold, empty, and staring through me. And then I saw her, the witch. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure cloaked in shadow. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grin that chilled me to my core. She didn't move, but I felt her presence all around us, closing in. Claire, we need to go, I said, grabbing her arm. She didn't respond. I dragged her to the RV, half carrying her as the witch followed. The air grew heavier with each step, and I could hear the whispers in my head now, urging me to give up. We reached the RV just as the witch reached the clearing. She raised one skeletal hand, and I felt an invisible force pulling me back. Claire, still clutching the amulet, finally seemed to snap out of her trance. The amulet, she whispered. She wants it. I pried it from her hand and threw it as hard as I could into the woods. The witch let out a scream that shook the ground, and then she vanished, leaving only silence. We drove away without looking back. But the witch wasn't done with us. At home, Claire became distant, sketching symbols from the cairns over and over. I found myself waking in the middle of the night, hearing whispers that weren't there. Last week, I found a small cairn in our yard, the same symbols carved into the rocks. I don't think we escaped Bell Mountain. I think the witch came with us. My name is Florentino Perez, and back in 2022, I took my RV up to the Custer National Forest in Montana. I figured escaping the city for a week would do me good, even if my idea of roughing it usually involves forgetting my phone charger. After a grueling year crunching numbers as an accountant, I craved the simplicity of the wilderness. No spreadsheets, no meetings, just me and the great outdoors. I joked with my friends that I'd probably get lost without GPS, but secretly I was excited for an adventure. The drive was serene. Towering pines lined the winding roads, and the crisp mountain air seeped through my open windows. I hummed along to classic rock tunes, feeling lighter with each mile that distanced me from the concrete jungle. Upon arriving at the campground, I noticed it was sparsely populated, exactly what I wanted. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a gentle stream. As I set up camp, an older man named Hank strolled over from a nearby site. "First time up here?" he asked, a friendly grin beneath his bushy mustache. "Is it that obvious?" I chuckled, wrestling with a tent pole that seemed determined to defy me. He laughed. Need a hand? Sure, unless you want front row seats to me losing a fight with camping gear. Together, we got the tent pitched in no time. Hank shared a few tips about the area, good fishing spots, trails worth hiking, places to avoid. He mentioned a trail that led to an old abandoned mining town a few miles deeper into the forest. Why is it abandoned? I asked. Just dried up, he said with a shrug. But some folks say it's haunted. I raised an eyebrow. Ghost stories already? You work fast. He smiled. Just keeping the tradition alive. You take care out here. That evening, I built a small campfire and cooked dinner. The stars emerged, brighter than I'd ever seen them. As I sat there sipping a beer, I felt a contentment that had eluded me for years. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to hike to the old mining town Hank mentioned. I packed a day bag, grabbed my map, and set off. The trail was overgrown in places, but the path was still visible. About an hour in, I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't seen visitors in decades. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I peered inside, just old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Looks like the cleaning service skipped this one, I muttered. Continuing on, I noticed the forest grew denser. The canopy above thickened, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air felt cooler, and the sounds of wildlife seemed to fade. After another hour, I reached the remnants of the mining town. Weathered buildings leaned at precarious angles, windows shattered, roofs caved in. There was an eerie stillness to the place. I wandered through the main street, or what was left of it, taking in the ghostly atmosphere. As I approached what appeared to be an old general store, I spotted fresh footprints in the dirt. Maybe Hank wasn't kidding about ghosts, I joked to myself, though a prickle of unease ran up my neck. I followed the footprints around the back of the store and found a makeshift campsite. There was a small tent, a smoldering fire pit, and scattered belongings. It looked recently abandoned. Hello? I called out. Anyone here? No response. I glanced around. There was a notebook lying near the tent. Curiosity piqued. I picked it up. Flipping through the pages, I realized it was filled with handwritten notes, ramblings about purification, cleansing, and making sacrifices to redeem the unworthy. Well, that's not creepy at all, I whispered, my attempt at humor falling flat. A sudden snap of a twig made me spin around. A man stood a few yards away, watching me intently. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. Can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. You're trespassing, he replied, his voice flat. Sorry, I didn't realize. I thought this was abandoned. He took a step closer. It's not. Leave. All right, no problem. I'll get out of your hair. I placed the notebook back where I found it and started to walk away. Something about the man's gaze unsettled me. As I retraced my steps out of the town, I felt his eyes boring into my back. The return hike seemed longer. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I chided myself for being paranoid. Back at my campsite, I tried to shake off the encounter. I spent the afternoon fishing at the stream, catching nothing but enjoying the tranquility. By evening, I'd almost forgotten about the strange man. As darkness fell, I settled in by the fire with a book. The silence was comforting, until it was broken by the distant sound of footsteps. I looked up, expecting to see Hank or another camper, but saw nothing. Probably an animal, I told myself. An hour later, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam illuminated the trees, but revealed nothing else. Hello? Is someone there? Silence. Unease crept back in. Deciding it was best to turn in, I locked the RV door and settled into bed. Sleep came fitfully. A loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding. The clock read 2:17 a.m. Holding my breath, I listened intently. Another thud, this time accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the RV's exterior. I crept to the window and peeked out. In the dim moonlight, I saw a figure standing near the fire pit. It was the man from the mining town. He was holding something long and sharp, a machete. Okay, this is officially not funny, I whispered. He began circling the RV, dragging the machete along the metal side, creating a shrill, grating noise. My mind raced. I reached for my phone to call for help. No signal. Of course, I muttered. Should have invested in that satellite phone. I remembered the flare gun stashed in the emergency kit. Grabbing it, I weighed my options. Firing it might scare him off or attract help. As I contemplated, a voice called out, "Come out, we need to talk." "Yeah, I bet we do," I said under my breath. He banged on the door. "You're contaminated. You need cleansing." Fantastic. A lunatic, I thought. Deciding to take action, I shouted, "Leave now, or I'll call the police." He laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "They can't help you out here." I loaded the flare gun, aimed it at the door, and waited. Suddenly, the window beside me shattered. I stumbled back as his arm reached through, swiping the machete wildly. Without thinking, I fired the flare gun. The flare struck his arm, igniting his sleeve. He screamed, pulling back and stumbling away from the RV. Seizing the moment, I grabbed my keys, dashed to the driver's seat, and started the engine. The RV roared to life. I slammed it into gear and floored the accelerator. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the side mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, flames flickering on his arm, watching me disappear into the night. My hands trembled on the wheel. I needed to get to safety. The nearest ranger station was miles away, but I didn't dare stop. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights ahead. The ranger station. I pulled in, honking the horn wildly. A ranger emerged, startled. I jumped out, babbling about the attack. He led me inside, calmed me down, and called for backup. By dawn, a search party was organized. They found my campsite, a mess of broken glass and scatin of the man. But they ventured to the old mining town. There they discovered something far worse. Behind one of the collapsed buildings, they found shallow graves, 3 bodies in various states of decay. The coroner later identified them as hikers who had gone missing over the past year. Among the belongings at the makeshift campsite was a journal. Inside were detailed accounts of the man's self-appointed mission to purify the forest by eliminating those he deemed unworthy. His name was revealed to be Silas Morton, a former environmental scientist who had gone off the grid after a mental breakdown. He believed that humanity was a blight on nature and had taken it upon himself to cleanse the wilderness. The authorities searched for weeks, but never found him. Some speculated he perished from his injuries. Others believed he vanished deeper into the mountains. I returned home, the weight of the experience heavy but grateful to be alive. The police assured me they'd continue the search. In the end, Silas Morton's delusions led him to commit unspeakable acts, all in the twisted belief that he was saving the very thing he was destroying. It all started in a small town in Pennsylvania back in the summer of 2006. I was fishing at Lake Wallenpaupack, a serene spot that usually calmed my mind. My name is Enoch Bradshaw. I'd had my share of troubles, grew up rough, lost my parents young, did a stint in the military, and now I was trying to find some peace. Fishing was my escape, my quiet time to think. I set out early before dawn when the water was still and the world felt like it was holding its breath. My buddy Lester Vandross and I had planned this trip for weeks. Lester, a big, burly guy with a wicked sense of humor, was already waiting at the dock with a grin on his face and a cooler full of beer. "Enoch, you old dog, thought you'd never show up," he said, handing me a can as I climbed into the boat. "Can't miss out on a chance to outfish you, Les," I replied, cracking open the beer. We motored out to our usual spot, a quiet cove sheltered by pine trees. The sky was just starting to lighten, and the mist on the water gave the place an eerie, otherworldly feel. We cast our lines and settled in, bantering back and forth like we always did. By mid-morning, we'd caught a few decent-sized bass and were feeling pretty good about ourselves. The sun was high, and the lake was starting to get busy with other boats. That's when we noticed something odd. A strange, low hum seemed to come from the depths of the lake. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a vibration you could feel in your bones. Lester looked at me, eyebrows raised. "You hear that?" he asked. "Yeah. Probably just some engine trouble on one of the other boats," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. We tried to ignore it and keep fishing, but the hum grew louder, more insistent. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I glanced around, uneasy, but there was nothing to see, just the same peaceful lake and the same clear blue sky. "I don't like this, man," Lester said, frowning. "Feels like we're being watched." I laughed it off, but there was a knot of worry in my stomach. "Relax, Les. You're getting paranoid." We fished for another hour, the unease growing with each passing minute. Then we heard a splash, much bigger than any fish we'd ever seen. I turned just in time to see something massive break the surface of the water. It was only there for a moment, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Did you see that?" Lester whispered, eyes wide. "Yeah," I said, my mouth dry. "Let's get the hell out of here." We started the engine and headed back toward the dock, our hearts pounding. But as we rounded a bend, we saw something that made us stop in our tracks. There, on the shore, was a pile of fish. Dozens of them, all torn apart and scattered like they had been mauled by some massive creature. "What the?" Lester breathed, his face pale. We got closer and the smell hit us, blood and decay. I could see the bite marks on the fish, large and jagged, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Something's out there, man," I said, my voice shaking. "Something big." We didn't talk much on the way back to the dock. The hum was back, louder than ever, and I could feel it vibrating through the boat. We docked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those fish, mangled and torn apart. I heard that hum, felt it in my bones. I knew I should report it, but who would believe us? A couple of guys with a few beers in them talking about monsters in the lake. The next morning, I called Lester. His wife, Mabel, answered the phone. "Enoch, thank God you called," she said, her voice shaking. "Lester didn't come home last night." My heart sank. "What do you mean? We left together." "He said he was going to check something out at the lake," she said. "He didn't say what, just that he had a bad feeling." I grabbed my keys and drove to the lake, my mind racing. The place was deserted, but Lester's truck was parked near the dock. I found his boat tied up, empty. The hum was still there, louder than ever. I searched for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him, just that damn hum growing louder and more menacing. By late afternoon, I was ready to give up. I sat on the dock, staring at the water, when I heard a splash behind me. I turned and saw a figure standing in the water, half submerged. It was Lester. "Jesus, Les, where the hell have you been?" I shouted, running toward him. But as I got closer, I saw that something was wrong. His eyes were wide and glassy, and he was muttering to himself, words I couldn't understand. "Les, talk to me," I said, wading into the water and grabbing his arm. He turned to me, his face twisted in fear. "It's in the water, Enoch," he whispered. "It's in the water." Before I could respond, he lunged at me, his hands around my throat. I fought him off, but he was strong, stronger than I'd ever seen him. We struggled, splashing in the shallow water until I managed to knock him out. I dragged him back to the shore, panting and terrified. What the hell had gotten into him? I didn't have time to find out. As I looked back at the lake, I saw something moving beneath the surface, something huge and dark. I didn't wait to see what it was. I threw Lester over my shoulder and ran to the truck. We sped back to town, my heart pounding in my chest. I took him to the hospital, but he didn't wake up. The doctors said he was in some kind of shock, but they couldn't explain the bruises on his neck or the strange burns on his skin. I didn't go back to the lake after that. Whatever was out there, I wanted no part of it. Lester never recovered. He stayed in that coma for months before passing away. The official cause was never determined, but I knew the truth. There was something in that lake, something that had taken my friend and almost taken me. Years went by and the memory of that day faded, but it never left me. I still hear that hum sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. One day, a local kid, Timmy Lawson, went missing near the lake. The whole town was out searching for him. I joined in despite my fear. We scoured the area, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Just like Lester, he had vanished without a trace. That night, I sat by the lake, staring at the water. The hum was back, louder than ever. And then I saw it, a dark shape moving beneath the surface. Too big to be a fish, too fast to be anything natural. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let another person fall victim to whatever was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife and waded into the water. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. I could see the shape moving closer, a dark, hulking mass just beneath the surface. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered, gripping the knife. "Come and get me." The shape surged forward and I braced myself, but instead of attacking, it stopped just a few feet away. I could see its eyes now, glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. And then it spoke. "Leave this place," it said, its voice a low, guttural rumble. "Leave and never return." I stood my ground. "Not until you tell me what you are," I said, my voice shaking. The creature tilted its head as if considering. "I am the guardian of this lake," it said. "I protect it from those who would harm it." "By killing people?" I demanded. "By any means necessary," it replied. "Your friend disturbed the balance. He had to be stopped." "And Timmy, what did he do?" "He was curious," the creature said. "Curiosity can be dangerous." I felt a surge of anger. "So you just kill anyone who comes near? That's your solution?" The creature seemed to sigh. "It is not my choice," it said. "It is my duty." I stared at it, my mind racing. "There has to be another way," I said. "We can find a way to coexist." The creature regarded me for a long moment. "Perhaps," it said finally, "but for now, you must leave." I knew I couldn't fight it. Not here. Not now. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature. It watched me go, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. I returned to town, shaken but determined. I told the sheriff what had happened, but he didn't believe me. No one did. They thought I was crazy, just like they had with Lester. But I knew the truth. I never went back to the lake after that, but I kept an eye on it and on the people who went there. I warned them, tried to keep them away. Some listened, some didn't, and every now and then someone would go missing. But I knew I had done everything I could. I had faced the creature and lived to tell the tale, and as long as I was alive, I would keep fighting, keep warning people, because there was something in that lake, something that had taken my friend and almost taken me, and I wouldn't let it take anyone else. Years later, the lake was drained as part of a construction project. They found the remains of over a dozen people at the bottom, dating back decades. The town was in an uproar, and the story made national news. But I knew the truth. The creature was gone, its duty fulfilled, and I could finally sleep at night, knowing that the lake was safe. My name is Albert Einstein, and it was back in 2018 when I set off in my rickety RV toward the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. I'd been meaning to make this trip for years, dreaming of peaceful evenings by a campfire, maybe some half-decent fishing and stargazing. My trusty mutt Lulu was about the only company I had left after a messy divorce and a career that went belly up. So there we were, just a man, his dog, and the open road. Sounded good on paper. The first few days went smoothly. No phone calls, no work stress, just me and Lulu with the mountains rolling past. But on the third day, I pulled up into a secluded clearing I had scouted online, planning to stay there for the night. The place was dead quiet, and the air felt still, like the whole world had hit the pause button. A perfect spot, or so I thought. That night, as I was trying to get a fire going, I heard something that sounded like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I brushed it off as a deer or some other wildlife, maybe hoping it wasn't a bear. The footsteps would stop when I stopped moving, like whoever or whatever, had no interest in being discovered. I'd crack a joke, but it didn't exactly feel like a time for humor. The noises stopped around midnight, just as abruptly as they started. I was relieved, chalking it up to paranoia or some animal passing through. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. The rocks I had left scattered around the fire pit were arranged in a neat little pile, stacked like some kind of primitive signal. My stomach tightened. Lulu, usually calm as a stone, was on edge too, sniffing around like he'd picked up a scent that made him uneasy. Maybe it was a harmless prank, or maybe not. Day 4 rolled around, and I figured I'd do a bit of exploring while there was still daylight. I packed up my gear, leaving my RV behind as I set out to find a nearby stream. After an hour or so of walking, I found a shallow creek, perfect for cooling off. I thought about taking a quick dip, but then I noticed something peculiar on the opposite bank. It was a pile of bones, all clean and white, like they'd been picked dry. At first, I thought they were from an animal. A deer, maybe, but then I saw what looked disturbingly like a human jawbone among the bones. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being followed. Each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me, making me turn around like a paranoid idiot. It didn't help that Lulu had started acting jumpy, growling at nothing in particular, his hackles up. I'd laugh if it weren't so unsettling. I headed back to the RV as fast as I could without making it look like I was running. The whole forest felt different now, like it was hiding something or someone. I locked the RV door that night, pulled down all the blinds, and settled in with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey, figuring I could sleep off the fear. But around midnight, I heard it again. Those footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling the RV. Deliberate, slow. My heart pounded so loud I was sure Lulu could hear it. I peeked out of a small gap in the blinds, and what I saw nearly made me drop the flashlight. A man, pale and gaunt, was standing just a few yards away, his face turned toward the RV. He looked as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years, his skin almost translucent, with dark patches like bruises on his arms and neck. He had something in his hand, a large hunting knife, which he was tapping against his thigh in a steady rhythm. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay still, hoping he'd go away if I didn't make a sound. But he didn't. He just kept standing there, staring at the RV like he could see through the walls. Then he started laughing, a low, humming chuckle that made my skin crawl. Lulu, bless his heart, stayed quiet but pressed against me, every muscle in his body tense. After what felt like hours, the man finally moved. He turned and walked back into the trees, leaving only his laughter echoing in the dark. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but eventually I drifted off, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I checked outside. There were fresh boot prints all around the RV, along with deep gouges in the dirt where he had dragged the knife. The rocks from my fire pit were scattered again. Only this time, they were arranged in a shape I couldn't quite recognize, like some strange symbol. I knew I had to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. It had been running fine all week, but now it was as dead as a doornail. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. It was like someone or something wanted me to stay. Panic started setting in, but I knew I couldn't lose my cool. I grabbed a small hatchet I'd packed and decided I'd hike out of there if it came to it. Lulu and I could cover a few miles to the nearest road. As I prepared to leave, I spotted something hanging from a nearby tree. It was a crude scarecrow made of sticks and what looked like animal fur with a human skull perched on top. The jaw was missing, just like the one I'd seen by the creek. My gut twisted. This guy wasn't just out to scare me. He wanted to make sure I knew he was watching, waiting. I didn't waste any more time. Lulu and I headed down the trail, sticking close to the path, moving as fast as we could. But the feeling of being followed never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man standing there with his knife. After a few hours of walking, I heard a voice calling my name. It was low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was close. Too close. My heart was pounding like a drum, but I forced myself to keep moving. Lulu was whimpering, pressing against my leg, clearly just as terrified. The voice kept calling over and over, each time sounding a little closer. Then I saw him, standing on the trail ahead of us, grinning. His teeth were sharp, broken in places like he'd been gnawing on something hard. He raised his knife, pointing it at me like an invitation. "I'm going to find you, Albert," he said, his voice raspy and guttural. "Ain't no one coming to save you." I swung my hatchet, keeping him at bay, and backed away, my heart hammering. He didn't flinch, he just stood there, grinning like he enjoyed the fear in my eyes. Then he lunged. I swung the hatchet hard, hearing a sickening crunch as it connected with his shoulder. He let out a low, guttural scream, but didn't stop. He kept coming, even with blood pouring down his arm. I ran, pulling Lulu with me, not looking back until we reached the edge of the clearing where the RV was parked. I could still hear his laughter echoing through the trees, fading as I reached the vehicle. Miraculously, the RV started up on the first try, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was standing there watching as I drove away. I floored it, heading straight for the nearest town, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally reached a gas station, I stumbled out, barely able to speak. The attendant took one look at me and called the cops. A few hours later, after I had calmed down enough to explain what happened, they sent out a search party. They didn't find him, just the remains of that makeshift scarecrow and the symbols etched into the dirt. They told me he was probably some local recluse, maybe a deranged survivalist who'd gone off-grid. But the look in their eyes told me they didn't believe that. Not really. Last I heard, They found another body near that campsite, a missing hiker who'd been out there a few months before. His jawbone was missing too, and every now and then I hear rumors from other campers, stories about a pale man with a knife who calls their name out in the woods. I haven't been back to the Smokies since, and I don't plan to. I parked my RV at a quiet corner of Salt Fork State Park, the lake glinting in the late afternoon sun. It was the perfect spot, serene, scenic, and most importantly, secluded. My latest children's book had stalled, and I hoped this trip would shake loose the creative cobwebs. Nature always had a way of whispering ideas to me, and the thought of using the park as inspiration for my next story felt promising. The first evening passed uneventfully. I spent it sketching ideas and jotting down notes about the park's landscape. But it wasn't until the second day, while wandering off the main trail, that I found the overgrown path. It wasn't marked, and the way the grass and underbrush had overtaken it told me it hadn't been used in years. My curiosity, ever my greatest strength and weakness, urged me forward. The path twisted and narrowed, the trees crowding closer as I ventured deeper. After about 20 minutes, I emerged into a clearing and stopped cold. Before me stood an abandoned playground. Rusty swings swayed faintly in the breeze, their chains groaning in protest. A half-collapsed merry-go-round sat crookedly on its axis, its faded red and yellow paint peeling like old wallpaper. Beyond the playground loomed a small cabin, its roof sagging and the door hanging half off its hinges. I raised my camera, taking pictures of the scene. The juxtaposition of childhood innocence and decay was haunting. It was exactly the kind of imagery I needed for my story. As I reviewed the photos, something made my skin prickle. There, in the background of one shot, was the faint outline of a child, a boy standing near the swings. But when I looked up, the clearing was empty. My heart thudded. It had to be a trick of the light, or so I told myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of the boy on the swings, the details of the playground etched into my thoughts. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft knock at the RV door. I froze, the pen in my hand hovering over my notebook. Another knock followed, louder this time. Cautiously, I moved to the door, peering out through the curtain. A boy stood there. He looked about 8 years old, with dark, curly hair and a solemn expression. His clothes were oddly old-fashioned, a white shirt with suspenders smudged with dirt. He looked up at me, his eyes impossibly wide. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened the door hesitantly. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" "They're not here," he said. "I'm looking for my friends. Can you help me find them?" Something about him unnerved me. Maybe it was the way his voice sounded hollow or how he avoided my eyes after the first glance. But before I could respond, he turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I called after him. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and followed. The path led back to the playground. The swings creaked in the wind, and the shadows cast by the moon seemed darker here. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam dancing over the rusted equipment. The boy was nowhere to be seen. I stepped closer to the cabin, its door now swinging open as if inviting me in. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and rot. My flashlight illuminated the walls, and I sucked in a breath. They were covered in crude drawings, childlike scribbles in black crayon. Figures with hollow eyes, a large shadowy man looming over smaller stick figures, children holding hands in a circle. I backed away, the hair on my arms standing on end. That's when I noticed the logbook on a dusty table. I flipped through its brittle pages, finding entries from the 1970s. It had been a caretaker's log, documenting routine maintenance of the playground, but the last few entries changed in tone, becoming frantic. 2 children missing, authorities notified, searched all night, no sign. More children gone, something wrong with the water near the bridge. The final entry read, "They're not missing. They're here, and he won't let them leave." A chill ran down my spine as I closed the logbook. I heard laughter, faint, childlike giggles echoing from outside the cabin. I rushed out, heart pounding. The playground was empty, but the laughter continued, weaving between the trees. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw them. Shadowy figures darting between the trunks, too small and quick to be adults. The laughter turned cruel, mocking, as if the forest itself were toying with me. The next morning, I drove into town, desperate for answers. At the local cafe, I struck up a conversation with an older waitress, her name tag reading Ela. When I mentioned the playground, her face darkened. "That place should have been torn down years ago," she muttered, setting down my coffee. "Kids started disappearing back in the 70s. They searched for weeks but never found them." "What about the caretaker?" I asked, recalling the logbook. She hesitated before answering. There were rumors that he knew more than he let on. Some say he was obsessed with the kids, keeping them close, even after they were gone. Folks around here call him the caretaker's shadow now. They say he's still out there. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and drive as far as I could. But something, whether it was my curiosity or that boy's haunting eyes, drew me back to the playground. That evening, as dusk fell, I stood by the swings, my camera in hand. The boy appeared again, this time at the edge of the clearing. "You found them, didn't you?" he asked. "Found who?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" "My friends," he said, stepping closer. His face seemed paler now, his features sharper, almost gaunt. "They're waiting for me, but the caretaker won't let them go." Before I could respond, the air grew colder. The boy turned his head sharply, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I spun around, my flashlight revealing nothing but shadows. Yet I felt it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, bearing down on me. "Run," the boy whispered. I bolted toward the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the laughter had turned to shrieks, high-pitched and inhuman. I slammed the cabin door shut and fumbled with my flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. The air inside felt suffocating, and the shadows seemed to ripple and shift. My gaze fell on the drawings again, and I noticed something I hadn't before, a lantern sketched into one corner, its flames surrounded by jagged lines. Desperate, I searched the cabin and found it, an old lantern, rusted but intact. Beside it lay a whistle, tarnished with age. I grabbed both, feeling a strange sense of purpose. Outside, the playground was alive with movement. The swings and merry-go-rounds spun wildly, though there was no wind. The boy stood in the center, his figure wavering like a mirage, and looming behind him was a shadow, the caretaker. He was massive, his form indistinct but menacing. His eyes glowed faintly, locking onto me as I stepped into the clearing. The boy turned, his face pleading. "Help us!" I lifted the whistle and blew with all my might. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air, and the shadows recoiled. The caretaker let out a guttural roar, his form flickering like a dying flame. I lit the lantern, its weak light growing brighter and brighter until it bathed the playground in a warm glow. The boy smiled, his face softening. One by one, other children appeared, their shadowy forms dissolving into faint golden light. They gathered around the boy, and together they turned toward the forest, fading into the trees. The caretaker let out one final anguished cry before collapsing into the earth. The playground fell silent, its rusted equipment still at last. I returned to my RV, my hands shaking. The next morning, I left Salt Fork without looking back. That night, as I reviewed my photos, I found one last image I didn't remember taking. It was of the playground, bathed in the lantern's light, with the boy and his friends standing together, their faces serene. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, was the shadow of a man watching. My name is Jeremy Doku, and I was 37 years old when this happened in October 2022. I'm a freelance writer, mostly covering travel and folklore. I've spent years chasing stories, driving my RV from one place to the next, always chasing inspiration or maybe just running away. Back then, I thought of myself as independent, untethered, invincible, but Spruce Knob changed that. It was supposed to be a quick trip. I'd heard whispers about a place in West Virginia where strange things happened. Laughing voices in the woods, small footprints appearing where no child had walked in decades. The locals called it the Lost Children of Spruce Knob. The legend was vague, tied to an old settlement that had long since disappeared, a winter storm, children wandering too far, and a tragedy that no one liked to talk about. It was exactly the kind of story my editor loved. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The drive had been rough, the winding roads climbing higher and higher into the dense forest. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settles in your bones. My RV sputtered a bit as I parked, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to minor mechanical issues. The campsite was deserted, just how I liked it. Solitude made it easier to write. I spent the first hour setting up, unpacking my laptop and notes, snapping a few photos of the eerie, misty forest for my article. By the time I lit a small fire, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a dusky blue. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, like the distant hum of the wind, but as I sat by the fire sipping lukewarm coffee, the sound grew clearer. Laughter, high-pitched and playful, like children chasing each other in a game of tag. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. The nearest town was miles away. Who would bring children all the way out here at night? Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The laughter stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of too many ghost stories and too much caffeine. But as I turned back to the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints. They were small, barefoot, pressed into the dirt just outside my RV. A trail of them circled the fire pit and wandered toward the trees. My stomach churned. I crouched, running my fingers over one of the prints. It couldn't have been there long. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind or dew. I took a photo. The click of my camera was loud in the still morning air. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, straightening, but even as I brushed it off, my pulse quickened. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the dense woods with my notebook in hand. The forest felt oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every twig snapping underfoot. I found an abandoned cabin about a mile from the campsite, its roof caved in, walls covered in moss and lichen. Inside, I discovered old, yellowed pages scattered across the floor. The handwriting was faint, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The cabin had belonged to a family who'd settled here in the 1800s. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. During a brutal winter, the father sent the children out to gather firewood. A storm rolled in suddenly and they never came back. Their bodies were never found, and the parents were said to have gone mad with grief. I shivered, hugging my coat tighter. The pages felt heavy in my hands, the words pressing into my mind like a weight. That night, the laughter returned. It started faintly, just like before, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the RV, but then it grew more deliberate. Tap, 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 like small fingers drumming against the window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden under my blanket, to pretend I didn't hear it, but curiosity is a terrible thing. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the window. The fog outside was thick, swirling like smoke, but through it I saw a shape, a small figure standing just beyond the fire pit. My breath caught. It was a little girl, no older than 7, with long hair tangled around her face. Her dress was ragged, her bare feet pale against the damp earth. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted as if waiting for me to step outside. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "Nope," I whispered. "No way." The tapping stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. The next morning, my RV wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but the engine just coughed and sputtered. The battery was fine, the fuel gauge full. I had no explanation. "Great," I muttered, slamming the steering wheel. "Just great." There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I was stranded. Determined to distract myself, I decided to hike back to the cabin. Maybe I could find more of the journal pages, something to help me understand what was happening. But as I neared the cabin, the forest seemed darker, the air colder. I found the doll on the trail. It was old, its fabric faded and torn, one button eye missing. It hadn't been there the day before. I hesitated, staring at it. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a flicker of motion among the trees. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. "Jeremy?" A voice whispered. I spun around, my pulse racing. "Jeremy?" It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, coming from deeper in the woods. "Nope," I said again, backing away. But as I turned to leave, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help us." I ran. By the time I reached the RV, I was shaking. My rational mind was unraveling, every explanation I'd clung to slipping through my fingers. I locked the door and curled up on the bed, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The children didn't wait for nightfall this time. The laughter echoed through the forest, closer and louder than ever. Shadows darted outside the windows, too quick to be seen clearly. The tapping returned, relentless and mocking, and then they came inside. I didn't see them enter, but suddenly they were there, 3 small figures standing at the foot of my bed. Their faces were pale and frostbitten, their eyes wide and hollow. Why didn't they come back for us? The little girl asked, her voice like a cold wind. I don't know, I stammered. They promised, the boy said. They promised they'd come back. My breath hitched as tears filled my eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They stared at me, their expressions unreadable, and then they were gone. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I gathered firewood and built a small pyre near the cabin. I placed the doll on top, along with an offering of food and a scarf I found in my RV. Lighting the fire, I whispered a prayer, not to any god I knew, but to the lost children. I hope this helps, I said, my voice cracking. I hope it guides you home. The air grew still, the forest holding its breath. For a moment I thought I'd failed, but then the fire flared, a brilliant golden light that chased away the shadows. The fog lifted. The forest seemed quieter, calmer. When I returned to the RV, it started on the first try. I never wrote the article. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some wounds aren't meant to be reopened. But I left Spruce Knob with a strange sense of peace, as if the children had finally found their way. And maybe in some small way, so had I. My name is Scott Hunter, and it was back in 2017 when I set off in my rickety RV toward the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. I'd been meaning to make this trip for years, dreaming of peaceful evenings by a campfire, maybe some half-decent fishing and stargazing with my trusty mutt, Lou. Lou was about the only company I had left after a messy divorce and a career that went belly up. So there we were, just a man, his dog, and the open road. It sounded good on paper. The first few days went smoothly. No phone calls, no work stress, just me and Lou with the mountains rolling past. But on the third day, I pulled up into a secluded clearing I'd scouted online, planning to stay there for the night. The place was dead quiet, and the air felt still, like the whole world had hit the pause button. A perfect spot, or so I thought. That night, as I was trying to get a fire going, I heard something that sounded like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I brushed it off as a deer or some other wildlife, maybe hoping it wasn't a bear. The footsteps would stop when I stopped moving, like whoever or whatever it was had no interest in being discovered. I'd crack a joke, but it didn't exactly feel like a time for humor. The noises stopped around midnight, just as abruptly as they'd started. I was relieved, chalking it up to paranoia or some animal passing through. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. The rocks I'd left scattered around the fire pit were arranged in a neat little pile, stacked like some kind of primitive signal. My stomach tightened. Lou, usually calm as a stone, was on edge too, sniffing around like he'd picked up a scent that made him uneasy. Maybe it was a harmless prank, or maybe not. Day 4 rolled around and I figured I'd do a bit of exploring while there was still daylight. I packed up my gear, leaving my RV behind as I set out to find a nearby stream. After an hour or so of walking, I found a shallow creek, perfect for cooling off. I thought about taking a quick dip, but then I noticed something peculiar on the opposite bank. It was a pile of bones, all clean and white, like they'd been picked dry. At first, I thought they were from an animal, a deer, maybe, but then I saw what looked disturbingly like a human jawbone among the bones. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being followed. Each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me, making me turn around like a paranoid idiot. It didn't help that Lou had started acting jumpy, growling at nothing in particular, his hackles up. I'd laugh if it weren't so unsettling. I headed back to the RV as fast as I could without making it look like I was running. The whole forest felt different now, like it was hiding something, or someone. I locked the RV door that night, pulled down all the blinds, and settled in with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey, figuring I could sleep off the fear. But around midnight, I heard it again, those footsteps. This time they were closer, circling the RV, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded so loud I was sure Lou could hear it. I peeked out of a small gap in the blinds, and what I saw nearly made me drop the flashlight. A man, pale and gaunt, was standing just a few yards away, his face turned toward the RV. He looked as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His skin almost translucent, with dark patches like bruises on his arms and neck. He had something in his hand, a large hunting knife, which he was tapping against his thigh in a steady rhythm. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay still, hoping he'd go away if I didn't make a sound. But he didn't. He just kept standing there, staring at the RV like he could see through the walls. Then he started laughing, a low, humorless chuckle that made my skin crawl. Lou, bless his heart, stayed quiet but pressed against me, every muscle in his body tense. After what felt like hours, the man finally moved. He turned and walked back into the trees, leaving only his laughter echoing in the dark. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but eventually I drifted off, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I checked outside. There were fresh boot prints all around the RV, along with deep gouges in the dirt where he had dragged the knife. The rocks from my fire pit were scattered again, only this time they were arranged in a shape I couldn't quite recognize, like some strange symbol. I knew I had to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. It had been running fine all week, but now it was as dead as a doornail. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. It was like someone, or something, wanted me to stay. Panic started setting in, but I knew I couldn't lose my cool. I grabbed a small hatchet I had packed and decided I'd hike out of there if it came to it. Lou and I could cover a few miles to the nearest road. As I prepared to leave, I spotted something hanging from a nearby tree. It was a crude scarecrow made of sticks and what looked like animal fur, with a human skull perched on top. The jaw was missing, just like the one I'd seen by the creek. My gut twisted. This guy wasn't just out to scare me. He wanted to make sure I knew he was watching. Waiting. I didn't waste any more time. Lou and I headed down the trail, sticking close to the path, moving as fast as we could, but the feeling of being followed never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man standing there with his knife. After a few hours of walking, I heard a voice calling my name. It was low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. My heart was pounding like a drum, but I forced myself to keep moving. Lou was whimpering, pressing against my leg, clearly just as terrified. The voice kept calling over and over, each time sounding a little closer. Then I saw him. He was standing on the trail ahead of us, grinning. His teeth were sharp, broken in places, like he'd been gnawing on something hard. He raised his knife, pointing it at me like an invitation. "I'm gonna find you, Russell," he said, his voice raspy and guttural. "Ain't no one coming to save you." I swung my hatchet, keeping him at bay, and backed away, my heart hammering. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, grinning like he enjoyed the fear in my eyes. Then he lunged. I swung the hatchet hard, hearing a sickening crunch as it connected with his shoulder. He let out a low, guttural scream, but didn't stop. He kept coming, even with blood pouring down his arm. I ran, pulling Lou with me, not looking back until we reached the edge of the clearing where the RV was parked. I could still hear his laughter echoing through the trees, fading as I reached the vehicle. Miraculously, the RV started up on the first try, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was standing there, watching as I drove away. I floored it, heading straight for the nearest town, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally reached a gas station, I stumbled out, barely able to speak. The attendant took one look at me and called the cops. A few hours later, after I'd calmed down enough to explain what happened, they sent out a search party. They didn't find him, just the remains of that makeshift scarecrow and the symbols etched into the dirt. They told me he was probably some local recluse, maybe a deranged survivalist who'd gone off the grid. But the look in their eyes told me they didn't believe that. Not really. Last I heard, they found another body near that campsite, a missing hiker who'd been out there a few months before. His jawbone was missing too. And every now and then I hear rumors from other campers, stories about a pale man with a knife who calls their name out in the woods. I haven't been back to the Smokies since, and I don't plan to. My name is Marino Norman, and I'm 31 years old. This happened during the early fall, just when the trees in the Ozarks were beginning to turn fiery shades of red and orange. I was traveling through Missouri, staying at a campground near Big Spring in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. I'd come here to capture the beauty of the land for a photography competition. My dream was to win and finally make a name for myself as a nature photographer. I've always enjoyed the solitude of these trips. There's something about being alone in nature, away from the noise of the world, that makes everything seem clearer. But this trip reminded me that some places were never meant to be disturbed. The campground was small, almost deserted. I parked my RV at the far end near the tree line and spent the first day on trails, searching for the best vantage points. Big Spring was beautiful, its clear turquoise water fed by underground streams. But something about the air around the place felt heavy, almost oppressive. At a general store in town, I asked the clerk if there were any lesser-known spots I could check out. That's when she told me about the abandoned homestead near Big Spring. "People don't go out there," she said, leaning over the counter. "It's cursed, they say, belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft long ago." I laughed. "Cursed? You're joking, right?" She shook her head. "The locals call it the Forgotten Homestead. You can hear her whispers if you get too close." I brushed it off as local superstition, but I couldn't help being intrigued. A mysterious old homestead, overgrown and hidden in the woods, sounded perfect for the moody, atmospheric shots I needed for my portfolio. The next morning, I set out for the homestead. The trail leading there was faint, overgrown with vines and brambles, but I'd managed to find an old map online that showed its approximate location. My GPS was useless. Every time I tried to mark my position, the screen froze or the app crashed. About an hour into the hike, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, carried on the wind like the sound of distant voices. I stopped and turned, scanning the forest, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder as I walked, though I couldn't make out the words. By the time I reached the clearing, the air had grown cold, and the forest around me had gone eerily silent. The homestead lay in ruins, a crumbling stone foundation covered in moss and vines with an ancient well at its center. I stepped into the clearing, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The well drew my attention immediately. Its stone sides were etched with strange symbols, circles, jagged lines, and figures that looked like crude faces. I pulled out my camera and began snapping photos, or at least I tried to. Every time I raised the lens, the camera glitched. The images came out warped with streaks of static and light. Frustrated, I set the camera aside and began exploring the ruins. Inside what was once the homestead's main structure, I found fragments of old furniture and an object that made my skin crawl. A small doll, its face crudely stitched with black thread. Its button eyes stared back at me, unblinking. That night, I couldn't shake the unease I felt from the homestead. Back at the RV, I locked the doors and tried to distract myself by reviewing my photos from earlier in the day. To my surprise, most of them were clear, except for the shots of the homestead. In every one of those, a faint shadow stood near the well, a figure with long, tangled hair. A scratching noise pulled me out of my thoughts. It was faint at first, like tree branches brushing against the side of the RV, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light swept across the clearing, revealing claw marks etched into the RV's side, 4 deep grooves, too large to belong to any known animal. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle outside made my heart race. By dawn, I'd convinced myself it was just a bear or a coyote, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. Determined to finish what I started, I returned to the homestead the next day. The whispers greeted me as soon as I stepped onto the trail, louder than before. They were clearer now, a chorus of voices repeating a single word: leave. When I reached the clearing, she was there. The witch stood by the well, her form translucent but unmistakably human. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes glowed a sickly yellow. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her gaze bore into me. I stumbled back, but before I could run, something else emerged from the shadows, a massive, wolf-like creature with a skeletal frame and glowing eyes. It was her familiar, I realized, the creature she'd cursed to guard this place. I ran. The familiar gave chase, its footsteps pounding behind me. I could hear its growls, low and guttural, growing closer with each step. The trail blurred as tears filled my eyes, and I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When I turned, the creature was gone, but the air felt heavier, charged with the witch's presence. That night, I pieced together what I could about the homestead. The witch had been accused of poisoning the land and cursing the villagers who wronged her. They'd burned her alive at the stake, but her spirit lingered, tied to the well and the land around it. I realized the doll I'd found might be the key to breaking the curse. I grabbed it along with a lighter and some matches and headed back to the homestead. The clearing was darker than before, the trees seeming to close in around me. The witch appeared again, her familiar circling me like a predator stalking its prey. With trembling hands, I lit the doll on fire and dropped it into the well. The flames roared to life, brighter and hotter than seemed possible, and the witch let out a piercing scream. The forest grew still, the whispers faded, and the air felt lighter. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I ran back to the RV and drove until I reached the nearest town. And when I reviewed my photos later, one shot caught my eye. A clear image of the clearing, with the well in the center. Standing at its edge was the witch, her eyes fixed on the camera, as if she knew I'd be looking. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed. Some stories are better left untold. Eric Brindle, 42, slumped into his RV's worn leather seat as the dense New Hampshire forest blurred past the window. This was his sanctuary, his annual retreat. A time to cleanse his mind after years of wading through the murky world of forensic accounting, a profession that dealt not just with numbers, but with the unraveling of trust. Fraud didn't just destroy finances, it corroded souls, and Eric had seen enough to last several lifetimes. But this year felt different. His brother Mason had died 3 months ago, leaving Eric alone for the first time in years. The RV felt unnervingly quiet without Mason's ceaseless chatter, his stories that teetered between vivid imagination and outright lies. Eric hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on that voice until it was gone. The gravel road narrowed and opened into a small clearing. Towering pines surrounded the campsite, their silhouettes jagged and menacing in the fading light. Eric turned off the engine, and the sudden quiet settled over him like a shroud. Where solitude once brought peace, it now felt heavy and suffocating. He parked near the tree line, set up his camp, and lit a fire. The evening breeze carried a chill, whispering through the trees. Beneath the familiar pine scent lurked something else, a damp, earthy odor, like rot clawing its way to the surface. He brushed it off, cracking open a beer as the flames flickered. The forest darkened, the sky glittered with stars, a serene backdrop to his silent vigil by the fire. But serenity shattered when a sound, soft at first, like leaves stirring, snagged his attention. Eric tensed. Likely just a deer, he told himself, but the sound grew louder, deliberate. The chirping of insects and rustling of birds fell away, leaving an oppressive silence. His fingers tightened around the bottle. Animals didn't stop like that. They didn't linger unseen, watching. The rustling ceased abruptly. The stillness made his skin crawl. Then he caught it, a flicker of motion in his peripheral vision. He turned, but whatever it was vanished before his eyes could focus. Shadows from the fire danced across the trees, playing cruel tricks on his mind. Snap! The wet crunch of something breaking reverberated through the clearing. His heart stuttered. He stood, the crackling fire suddenly feeble against the encroaching darkness. Something moved at the edge of the woods, too large and deliberate to be a deer. The outline was grotesque, its form dragging something heavy through the underbrush. He stepped back toward the RV, fear overtaking curiosity. But before he could act, it emerged, a creature that seemed wrong in every conceivable way. It was hunched, its limbs grotesquely long and spindly. Skin stretched tightly over bones jutted at disturbing angles, pale and glistening in the firelight. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but smooth, featureless flesh. It dragged a body behind it, limp and unmistakably human. Eric's breath hitched when his eyes locked onto the flannel shirt, the one Mason always wore. Mason. His voice broke, barely audible over the crackling flames. The creature's head snapped upward, though it lacked eyes. It sniffed the air, its movements jerky and unnatural. Eric stumbled backward, his pulse thundering in his ears as the creature let out a low, guttural gurgle. He turned and bolted for the RV. His fingers fumbled with the keys, the sound of scraping metal behind him sending ice down his spine. Just as the engine sputtered and failed, The creature's claws raked against the door. The sound was deafening, nails on a chalkboard amplified into a shrieking symphony. Panicked, Eric grabbed the fire extinguisher and swung it at the clawed hand, forcing its way inside. The creature recoiled, letting out a hideous screech. He seized the moment, clambering out the side door and sprinting into the woods. Branches tore at his face as he ran, the forest a maze of darkness. Behind him, the creature followed, its unnatural movements creating a cacophony of snapping branches and rustling leaves. It was faster than it should have been, and he could feel its presence closing in. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for rest, but he kept running until the trees gave way to a clearing. There, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood an old cabin. The door swung open, creaking softly in the breeze. With no time to think, Eric stumbled inside and slammed the door shut. He leaned against it, gasping for air. The cabin smelled of decay, the air thick and cloying. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he noticed something on the floor, a pile of bones. Human bones, broken and scattered like discarded trash. A sound outside froze him, the sickening crunch of something dragging itself closer. The door behind him groaned, the wood splintering under the weight of the creature's assault. Eric's legs refused to move as the door swung open. The last thing he saw was the creature, filling the doorway, its faceless head tilting as if to mock his terror. The last thing he heard was Mason's voice, whispering from somewhere in the darkness. "Run!" The first time I decided to take an extended break from my job as a criminal defense attorney, I thought camping would be the perfect escape. My latest case, a harrowing battle against a wrongful conviction, had drained me completely. My name is Asher Bell, and though I've spent most of my life entrenched in the shadows of the justice system, I've always found solace in nature. The idea of disappearing into the wilderness for a few days felt like exactly what I needed. I rented an RV and drove deep into the Yasha National Forest in Arkansas, a sprawling expanse of dense woods that promised the kind of isolation I craved. The journey was uneventful, but as I ventured further from Little Rock, the forest began to feel different. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick it swallowed the sunlight. Shadows stretched long and dark, even in the midday glow. By the time I arrived at the empty campsite near a placid black lake, I was already questioning whether solitude had been the right choice. The day passed peacefully enough. I hiked nearby trails, feeling a fleeting calm in the stillness of the forest. But as evening fell, that calm shifted. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, an itch that wouldn't go away. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar quiet, the absence of the city's constant hum. By nightfall, I was sitting by the fire, trying to shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. The forest grew impossibly silent. The usual rustles of nocturnal creatures were absent, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Then I heard it, a rhythmic, deliberate thumping echoing through the trees. My heart sank as the sound grew louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV, the beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the fire's dying embers and the eerie hush of the woods. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A massive figure moved between the trees, its silhouette distorted by the shadows. It was tall, grotesquely so, hunched over with a twisted, animalistic gait. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just moving. It was approaching. The creature's steps were deliberate, each one shaking the ground beneath me. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. It stopped near the lake, its back to me, and sniffed the air. The moonlight glinted off its matted fur, revealing patches of scaled skin beneath. My stomach churned. This thing, it wasn't natural. I killed the flashlight and backed toward the RV, my movements slow, deliberate. But then it turned as if sensing me. The moment our eyes met, I felt an icy grip tighten around my chest. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque fusion of wolf and bear, its jaws lined with jagged, uneven teeth. Small, beady eyes burned with an intelligence far too cruel to belong to any ordinary animal. The thing moved suddenly, diving into the lake with an earth-shaking splash. I didn't wait to see what came next. I bolted into the RV, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I gripped the shotgun I'd brought more for peace of mind than protection. The night stretched on, each sound outside the RV sending waves of panic through me. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, but my dreams were haunted by the image of that creature's hollow, malevolent stare. When dawn broke, I ventured outside, desperate to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But the ground near the lake was torn up, massive prints gouged deep into the earth. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, elongated, clawed, and impossibly large. I should have left. Any sane person would have. But something in me, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, forced me to stay one more night. I spent the day exploring the area, finding more tracks leading deeper into the forest. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. Whatever this thing was, I knew it would come back. That evening, I built the fire higher and sat outside, shotgun within arm's reach. As the darkness swallowed the forest again, the dread returned, heavier this time. Hours passed, and just as I began to hope the creature had moved on, the thumping returned. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, towering over the trees at the edge of the clearing. In the firelight, I saw it clearly now. Its grotesque body, a patchwork of fur and scales, its long arms dangling like grotesque pendulums. It sniffed the air, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. When its head snapped in my direction, I ran. I barely made it to the RV before it let out a roar that shook me to my core. The creature slammed against the side of the vehicle, claws scraping against the metal, each strike more violent than the last. I gripped the shotgun, certain this was how I'd die. But then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The thing let out one last guttural growl before retreating into the forest. I didn't sleep, didn't move until dawn's light filtered through the trees. When I stepped outside, the ground was a mess of claw marks and deep gouges. I didn't wait this time. I packed up and left without looking back. As I sped away from the forest, the only thought echoing in my mind was this: whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with me. Even now, back in the safety of the city, I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. I've always hated driving at night. The inky blackness beyond the headlights, the suffocating silence. It unsettles me. But there I was, gripping the steering wheel of my old RV with knuckles bone white, as I navigated the snaking roads of northern Minnesota. It was 1985. I had nothing to lose. A failed job, a life worn thin in a cramped Minneapolis apartment. This road trip was supposed to be a reset, a chance to escape the city and think, but that night the road took me somewhere I'd never forget. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped through the RV. I knew I had to stop for the night. When I spotted a narrow, overgrown trail, a forgotten logging road leading to a forest clearing, I turned in. The clearing felt unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no distant rustle of animals, just silence so heavy it felt alive. Brushing it off, I parked, killed the engine, and leaned back to catch my breath. Stepping outside to stretch, the unease deepened. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. The towering pines stood like sentinels, their shadows swallowing the light. I told myself I was imagining things, cracked open a beer, and tried to settle in. Then I heard it, a soft tapping, faint, but deliberate. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, measured, growing louder. My pulse quickened. Gripping a flashlight, I stepped into the trees. The beams sliced through the darkness, casting jagged shadows. The tapping shifted, closer, louder. I turned in circles, the sound always just behind me. Something was following me, watching me. Then I saw it, a flash of movement, low to the ground, darting between the trees. I swung the light toward it, but it was gone. The stench hit me next. Decay and earth, putrid and raw. Gagging, I stumbled, my foot catching on something. I fell hard, and the flashlight skittered across the ground, illuminating the pile. Deer. Coyotes. Their bodies torn and mangled, stacked haphazardly in a grotesque heap. Blood glistened on fresh kills, pooling among the decayed remains. My stomach turned. No predator did this. This was something else, something unnatural. Panic gripped me and I ran, crashing through the brush. The tapping turned into pounding, a relentless drumbeat in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I clutched the knife from the drawer, the blade shaking in my trembling hand. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, like nails on metal, but it grew more insistent. Then a bang. Something heavy slammed against the RV, rocking it violently. I pressed myself against the wall, the knife useless in my grip. Peeking through the window, I saw it. It crouched low, its limbs grotesquely long, its matted hair hanging in filthy clumps. Moonlight glinted off its eyes, hollow and glinting with malice. It twisted its neck unnaturally, snapping its head toward me. And then it smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It wasn't even animalistic. It was wrong. Too wide, too sharp, filled with a knowing cruelty. My blood turned to ice. Dropping the knife, I scrambled to the driver's seat and turned the key. The RV roared to life, and I tore out of the clearing, branches scraping against the sides as I sped down the road. But it wasn't over. The RV lurched violently. The steering wheel jerked to the side. I fought for control, but the tires gave out, shredded to ribbons. Heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and stepped out, scanning the trees. The silence was back, heavy and suffocating. The tires weren't slashed, they were mutilated, torn by claws that left deep, jagged gashes in the metal. A chill ran down my spine. Something rustled behind me. I spun, rifle raised, but saw nothing. Then I felt it. Hot breath, damp and fetid, brushing the back of my neck. My hands tightened on the rifle as I turned slowly. It stood inches from me now, towering and grotesque, its grin impossibly wider. Its hair dripped with blood and mud, claws hanging at its sides like sickle blades. Its breath reeked of rot. I didn't think, I fired. The blast echoed through the trees and the creature staggered, letting out a guttural scream that reverberated in my bones. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door behind me and flooring it. The metal rims screamed against the road as I drove blindly into the night. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, hours later. The RV was wrecked, the tires in shreds, blood smeared along its sides. But I was alive. I don't know what I saw in those woods, and I don't care to find out. All I know is that the silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it smiles. I needed to escape. After a decade in the chaos of an emergency room, I felt like I was unraveling. 10 years of sirens, rushed decisions, and lives slipping through my fingers had worn me down. My name is Alden Gable, and I wasn't running away, I told myself that, but I needed space. Solitude. Silence. Northern Idaho's wilderness seemed perfect. No cell service, no patients, no alarms. Just me, my RV, and the vast embrace of Clearwater National Forest. The forest was ancient, a sea of trees so thick they smothered the sky. The nearest town was a ghost on the horizon. The only connection to civilization, a decrepit logging road that led me into the void. The first day was bliss, a fire crackling in the dark, a can of beans warming over the flames. The kind of quiet you can feel in your bones. As night swallowed the light, I lay in the stillness, the absolute silence comforting. Little did I know, it was the last time I'd feel safe. The next morning, I brewed coffee and ventured deeper into the woods, following a faded trail to a place marked on map as Old Clearwater. The forest seemed to change as I went. Trees rose like titans, their gnarled branches clawing at the gray sky. The underbrush thickened, strangling the trail, and the lively chatter of birds and insects melted into an oppressive silence. After an hour, I stumbled upon it, a forgotten logging camp frozen in time. Rusted equipment littered the clearing, their edges eaten by decades of decay. Cabins sagged under the weight of neglect, their windows staring blankly like empty sockets. A graveyard of trucks sat in the shadows, their rotted tires blending into the earth. There was no life here. Not a bird, not a squirrel. Nothing. Just me. I should have left, but curiosity tugged me further. The air hung heavy, thick with an undefinable wrongness. I felt watched, a prickling sensation crawling up my spine. It's just your nerves, I told myself. But my body knew better. On the hike back, the feeling worsened. Every snap of a twig, every shifting shadow twisted my stomach into knots. It wasn't my imagination. Something was there, lingering just out of sight. The forest felt alive, aware, as though it wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. I quickened my pace, clutching the small hunting knife on my belt. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon, the long fingers of dusk clawing at the edges of my vision. I gathered firewood in a frenzy, desperate for the comfort of flame. The fire helped, for a time. The light danced against the encroaching blackness, but it couldn't dispel the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze, my breath hitching as I strained to listen. The sound circled the campsite, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't an animal, not one I knew. Its steps were calculated, each one purposeful, as if it wanted me to hear it. Gripping my flashlight, I swept the beam across the trees. Shadows leaped and flickered, but nothing solid appeared. Still, the sound continued, inching closer, until it stopped. And then I saw it. A massive figure loomed at the edge of the light, half hidden behind the trees. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its hunched form cloaked in dark, matted fur. Long, sinewy arms hung low, nearly brushing the forest floor. Its movements were unnervingly smooth, too deliberate for any bear or animal I'd ever seen. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze, sharp and piercing, like a blade against my skin. My heart thundered as I stumbled backward toward the RV, fumbling with the door handle. The creature tilted its head, studying me, a predator assessing its prey. Finally, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it with trembling hands. Inside, the RV felt like a coffin. The thin walls offered no real protection against whatever was out there. I grabbed my shotgun, loading it with shaking fingers, and crouched near the window. Peeking out through a sliver in the blinds, I saw nothing. The creature was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. All night I sat frozen, seeing every creak of the RV a gunshot in the silence. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, expecting to see the hulking figure reappear. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to find massive clawed footprints circling the campsite. They vanished into the forest, as if the creature had been toying with me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I didn't wait to find out. I packed up and fled, my tires churning dirt as I tore down the logging road. Even hours later, as I reached the nearest town, the weight of those unblinking eyes stayed with me. I told my story to the sheriff, who listened with a grim expression. "You're not the first," he muttered, his eyes darkening. When I showed him the photos of the tracks, he didn't dismiss me. "We've had reports like this before. Never ends well." I left Idaho the next day, but the nightmare followed me home. While unpacking, I found a clump of fur caught in the RV door latch. Thick, coarse, and alien. Even now, back in the city, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting. Some things aren't meant to be found, and some forests should remain untouched. Dustin Harrow liked to keep things simple. That's what he told himself as he packed up his truck, hitched his RV, and pulled onto the open road. No grand plans, no schedules, just him and a week to burn. The grind of building maintenance wasn't glamorous, but it kept him busy enough that these escapes felt like his only taste of freedom. He had no family, no kids, and no one waiting at home. Camping alone in the quiet places where no one cared to venture suited him just fine. This time, it was the mountains of New Mexico near a place called Eagle Nest. A dot on the map, the town seemed to exist outside of time, its streets sleepy, its storefronts weathered. Perfect. Dustin wasn't much for company. On his way to the campground, he stopped at an old gas station. The pumps were relics from the 70s, and the faded sign swung creakily in the wind. The clerk, an older man with sunken eyes and skin like worn leather, barely looked at him as he muttered, "Stay clear of the hills past the campsite. Folks who wander up there don't always come back the same." Dustin shrugged it off. Every small town had its ghost stories. By the time he reached the campground, dusk had settled like a shroud over the valley. The place was nearly empty, just him and an old couple parked far off on the other side. He liked the isolation. He cracked a beer, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence wrap around him. But the silence wasn't right. The first night passed uneventfully, but too quietly. No coyotes howling, no owls hooting, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Dustin chalked it up to being high in the mountains. It was the second night that everything changed. He'd just finished roasting sausages over the fire when he noticed movement at the edge of the tree line. A shadow, too quick and too large for a deer. Probably a bear, he thought. But the way it moved, it didn't lumber or dart like a wild animal. It flowed, calculated. Curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and edged closer, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the pines. Then he heard it, a low rustling sound, deliberate and heavy. The flashlight's beam caught something. It crouched at the tree line, its form all wrong. The limbs were too long, stretching unnaturally like sinewy ropes. Its frame was thick and powerful, its movements unnervingly deliberate. Matted fur clung in patchy tufts to a body that seemed unfinished, as though nature had given up halfway through. But its face, that was the worst part. Flattened, malformed, with sagging skin that hung in unnatural folds. When it turned its head toward him, he froze. There were no eyes, just hollow indentations where they should have been. Yet he felt its gaze, cold and penetrating, drilling into him. The flashlight slipped from his grip, plunging the scene into darkness. Heart pounding, Dustin stumbled back to the RV, slamming the door behind him. His hands shook as he rummaged for the revolver his father had given him years ago. Outside, something thudded against the RV. Then came the sound of claws dragging across metal, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. Dustin aimed the gun at the door, his knuckles bone white around the grip. The scraping stopped. For a long moment there was silence, so thick and heavy it pressed against his ears. He finally dared to peek through the tiny window. Nothing. By morning, he almost convinced himself it had been a nightmare until he stepped outside. Gouges, deep and jagged, marred the RV's side as though something massive had raked claws across it. Footprints, impossibly large, sunk deep into the earth. He didn't waste time packing. Throwing his gear into the RV, he kept glancing at the tree line. As he tightened the last strap, he saw them. 2 of them. Standing unnervingly still at the forest's edge, their hollow faces turned toward him. The air around them seemed wrong, like it vibrated with a frequency his ears couldn't catch, but his body could feel. They didn't move, but Dustin felt their intent. He bolted into the RV and peeled out of the campground, the engine roaring in the still morning air. When he reached Eagle Nest, he stopped at the old gas station, desperate to see the clerk and demand answers. But the station was empty. The only sound, the static hiss of a forgotten radio in the corner. Dustin drove on, refusing to look back until the mountains disappeared in his rearview mirror. He wanted to believe it was all in his head. But the gouges in the RV and the footprints etched into the soil told a different story. Whatever he'd seen in those woods wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. And he knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished with him. My name is Jebediah Whitlock. For 15 years, I've been a carpenter in a small town called Tall Pine, nestled deep in the remote corners of Washington state. I'm a simple man, not prone to flights of fancy or superstition. I love the smell of fresh-cut wood, the satisfaction of a well-built chair, and the serenity of evenings spent by a campfire. That's why when I decided to take a solo trip in my old RV up to Lake Wallenpaupack, it was supposed to be just a break, a little fishing, a little hiking, a lot of quiet nothingness in between. What happened out there, though, changed everything. I left Tall Pine early, my RV rattling over the winding mountain roads as the dawn light sliced through the towering pines. The solitude of those roads was something I cherished. Just the hum of the engine and the occasional bird call. By the time I reached Lake Wallenpaupack, I had ventured deeper into the wilderness than I ever had before. The campsite I picked was the definition of isolation. No cell service, no campers for miles, nothing but me, the lake, and the woods. I set up camp, built a fire, and spent the afternoon fishing in the lake's mirror-like waters. Everything felt perfect. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the world shifted. A chill wind swept through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadows stretched long and jagged, and the peaceful rustle of the forest faded into a dense, unsettling quiet. That's when I first heard it. A low, resonant growl, too deep, too guttural to belong to anything I knew. It started faint, drifting across the still lake like a dark whisper, but soon grew louder, almost vibrating through the air. I froze. Every instinct told me to stay put, to not draw attention. But curiosity and fear locked me in place. I stared across the dark waters, searching for the source of the noise. My fire crackled, but its warmth suddenly felt feeble. The growl subsided, and with it came an oppressive stillness. No crickets, no wind, Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. I stoked the fire and stayed awake long into the night. When exhaustion finally claimed me, I retreated to the RV, locking the door, a habit, not a precaution. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of twisted shapes and unseen eyes watching from the forest. Morning brought no comfort. A thick fog had rolled in, muting the forest in a gray shroud. As I stepped outside, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. The dirt around my campsite was churned as though something massive had dragged itself through during the night. Deep gouges raked through the soil, each one too wide, too deep to belong to any animal I knew. Then I heard it again, that growl. Closer this time. I turned toward the sound, and there it was, a shadow, enormous and hulking, moving just beyond the fog's edge. My blood ran cold. It stepped closer, its shape materializing. Its legs were long and crooked, its hunched body swaying unnaturally. Thick, matted fur covered its form, and its head was like a wolf's, stretched and distorted, with a gaping maw of jagged teeth. It didn't have eyes, yet I knew it saw me. I could feel its gaze, cold and ancient, pinning me in place. Then it moved. The creature lurched forward with a shuddering gait, dragging something heavy behind it. My instincts finally kicked in, and I stumbled backward into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed the rifle I kept under the bed. The thing circled the RV, its claws scraping against the metal, deliberate and taunting. It wasn't trying to get in, not yet. It was toying with me, savoring my fear. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I flung the door open and raised the rifle. It stood there, towering over me, its grotesque head tilting as though curious. I fired, the shot shattering the silence. The bullet struck its shoulder, and it let out a roar that shook the very ground. It staggered but didn't fall. I fired again and again, each shot tearing into its massive frame. Blood sprayed across the ground, dark and viscous, but still, it advanced, its jaws snapping, its claws slicing the air. With a final, deafening blast, it collapsed, its body convulsing before going still. The silence returned, heavier than before. The creature's twisted form lay in a pool of its own blood, steam rising from the wounds in the frigid air. I stood there, shaking, the rifle still raised, half expecting it to rise again. When it didn't, I forced myself to move closer. Its body was unlike anything I had ever seen, a grotesque amalgamation of animal and nightmare. I took pictures, proof that this wasn't a fever dream, then packed my gear and left. When I returned to Tall Pine, I went straight to the sheriff. I expected skepticism, but when they saw the photos, their faces went pale. A team was sent to the lake. When they came back, they brought the creature's body with them. What happened to it after that, I don't know. But I do know this. I'll never go back to Lake Watchie, because whatever that thing was, I don't think it was alone. I've always been drawn to the idea of solitude. The kind you find far away from city lights and endless noise, where the trees stretch like sentinels into the sky and the air hums with the eerie, ancient silence of nature. Maybe that's why I bought the RV. I needed an escape. I'm Travis Dyer, an architect by trade, but more importantly, someone who spends far too much time bent over blueprints and dealing with self-proclaimed visionaries who think they're the second coming of Frank Lloyd Wright. The grind was suffocating, and I craved something raw and untamed, a reminder of what it felt like to just be. Northern Minnesota seemed like the perfect antidote. The forests there are endless, and the lakes gleam like dark mirrors under the sun. When I found a small clearing off a dirt road, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind, I thought I'd found paradise. The trees formed a canopy so thick that sunlight only filtered through in trembling patches. It was quiet, serene. The first night passed uneventfully. I grilled a steak, sipped a couple of beers, and watched the firelight dance against the encroaching darkness. The stars were dazzling, scattered across the sky like shards of glass. The silence wasn't oppressive, but humbling, making me feel like a tiny part of some vast, unfathomable design. I slept well that night. The second day, I decided to explore. A faint trail wound along a ridge before dipping down toward a lake about a mile away. I grabbed my gear, a backpack, some water, and a hunting knife my dad had given me years ago. The knife wasn't for hunting, it was for reassurance. Out here, you never knew what you might encounter. The deeper I went, The more the trees seemed to close in, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest was watching, waiting. Halfway to the lake, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a moose, but the steps were deliberate, heavy. Whatever it was following me, staying just out of sight. I froze, my ears straining. The moment I stopped, so did it. I turned, scanning the underbrush. Nothing. Just the faint rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. But the unease didn't leave me. It nestled in my chest, cold and insistent. When I reached the lake, I tried to shake it off. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the trees and sky in perfect haunting symmetry. I perched on a rock, sipping my water, willing myself to relax. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Across the lake, moving between the trees. It was fast, impossibly fast. There one moment, gone the next. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but the harder I looked, the more the forest seemed to blur. I told myself it was a deer or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. The air around me felt wrong. It was thicker now, heavier. The forest held its breath. I turned back toward the RV, quickening my pace as the unsettling sound resumed behind me. It matched my every step, relentless and deliberate. When I finally broke through the tree line into the clearing, my chest was tight, my shirt clinging to me with sweat. I spun around, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but the trail was empty. That night, the silence was suffocating. Every creak of the RV felt amplified, every rustle outside a sinister whisper. Around midnight, the noises started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. My pulse thundered in my ears as I grabbed the knife, clutching it like a lifeline. Then a knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. A tentative tap, tap on the door. My blood turned to ice. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I froze, the knife trembling in my grip. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Summoning every ounce of courage, I moved toward the door, peeking out the window. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint glow of embers from the fire pit. Against every instinct, I yanked the door open. The clearing was empty. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. And then I heard it. Breathing. Deep, slow, and impossibly close. The sound came from the darkness just beyond the firelight. My legs locked in place as I strained to see what was out there. And then it stepped into view. It was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall, with a hulking, misshapen frame. Its skin was mottled and dark, like old leather, and its face was almost human, almost. The eyes were too small, too sharp, glinting with a malicious intelligence. The mouth was unnaturally wide, revealing teeth too long and too jagged. It stared at me, unblinking, its head tilting as if it were studying me, deciding something. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It took a step closer, then another. Somehow I found my legs and bolted back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. The creature let out a sound, a guttural, gutted snarl that shook me to my core. The RV shuddered as it slammed into the side, the metal groaning under the force. I stumbled, grabbing for anything that could help. My hand closed around the flare gun in a drawer. The next slam rocked the RV so hard I nearly dropped it. I turned toward the door, the flare gun trembling in my grasp, and pulled the trigger. The flare burst out in a brilliant, searing arc of red, embedding itself in the door. The creature let out a screech, a horrible, wet, unnatural sound, and retreated into the shadows. I didn't wait. I fumbled the keys into the ignition, gunned the engine, and tore out of the clearing. The RV bounced and jolted as I plowed through the underbrush, but I didn't care. I had to get away. By the time I hit the main road, I was shaking so hard I could barely keep my grip on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a small, brightly lit town. The RV is up for sale now. I'll never set foot in those woods again. But even now, in the safety of city lights, I sometimes hear it in my dreams, that breathing slow and deliberate, and see those small, knowing eyes. And I know it's still out there, waiting. My name is Bradley Kessler. I'm a traveling contractor, and what I'm about to tell you happened on the night of August 4th, 1998. I was driving through a remote stretch of western Montana, a place where the wilderness feels endless and the stars look down with cold indifference. I had just finished patching up roofs in Missoula, and was heading toward Idaho, my old RV groaning with every turn. It wasn't unusual for me to sleep in the RV on these trips. I'd park somewhere quiet, let the night swallow me whole, and hit the road again at dawn. But that night, the quiet was a predator, not a sanctuary. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. It clung to my skin, coiled around my thoughts. I'd been living on the road for years, but this was different. My RV, with its peeling paint and creaky floorboards, felt less like a home and more like a coffin. Around midnight, I turned onto a dirt path near the Lolo National Forest. The road was barely more than a scar in the earth, overgrown and forgotten, but it suited me. I didn't want to be found. I should have realized that someone else might. The night dragged on in oppressive silence. Around 2 a.m., I woke up, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sweat drenched me despite the cool mountain air. I'd had panic attacks before, but this wasn't one of them. This was primal, a visceral certainty that I wasn't alone. The RV felt too small, too vulnerable. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was a deer outside or some drifter passing through, but then I heard it, a step, slow, deliberate, crunching gravel just outside. I froze. I've dealt with strangers before, some of them dangerous, but this wasn't the random shuffle of someone lost or drunk. These steps were calculated. They circled the RV, a predator sizing up its prey. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to move, but I had to see. I flicked on the light and shined it through the small window. Nothing. That's when I heard the voice. Bradley. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was a whisper, low and deliberate, slicing through the silence like a razor. The way my name rolled off their tongue made my skin crawl as though they were savoring it. Bradley. No one should have known I was there. No one could have known. I told myself it was some sick prank, some drifter messing with me, but deep down I knew better. I grabbed my revolver from under the driver's seat. My hands shook as I loaded it, but the weight in my palm steadied me. I shouted through the door, my voice stronger than I felt. Get the hell out of here! The laughter that followed wasn't loud, it was worse. It was low, guttural, amused. The door rattled and I nearly dropped the gun. Then the voice spoke again, this time cutting me open with a single word. Abby. My daughter's name. My blood turned to ice. My daughter Abby, who was 13 and lived halfway across the country. How could this person, this thing, know her name? I slammed the flashlight beam toward the door. The shadow was there now, tall, impossibly still, just outside. Its outline was humanoid, but something about it was wrong. My body refused to move, as though opening the door would let something far worse inside. But I couldn't do nothing. I kicked the door open, gun raised. The cold air hit me like a slap, but the figure was gone. The night was still again, save for the trees whispering secrets to each other. I swung the flashlight wildly, scanning the ground for footprints or any sign of movement, and then I saw it. Etched into the dirt, scrawled in jagged letters right by my RV, Abby, I didn't sleep. By dawn, I was already miles away, driving like a man possessed. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? That a ghostly voice whispered daughter's name in the middle of nowhere? That some shadow left her name in the dirt? Days later, I got the call. Abby was missing. Her mother, Jennifer, my ex-wife, was frantic. The police were searching, but there were no leads. No signs of struggle. It was as though she'd vanished into thin air, just like the shadow outside my RV. I dropped everything and drove straight to Ohio. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and dead ends. The voice haunted me, the laughter echoed in my ears, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her name scratched into the dirt. I never told Jennifer what happened that night. What would have been the point? She wouldn't have believed me. Just like the police didn't believe me when I finally broke down and told them about the voice, the shadow, the name. It's been years now, but I still hear it sometimes. Bradley, late at night, when the world is quiet and still. Abby, and I wonder if she's out there, if she's alive, and if he's with her. Life hasn't been smooth sailing for me, but I've never been one to complain. After spending a decade in the Marines, I figured it was time to slow down. I took up long-haul trucking. Not glamorous, but the solitude of the road suited me. I'm not much of a talker. Those who knew me would describe me as steady, reliable, always have been, always will be. At least, that's what I thought. 2 weeks ago, I decided to take a break from it all. I'd saved enough for an extended trip, and RV camping sounded like the perfect escape. The idea of going off-grid, no phones, no schedules, just the wild quiet of nature was exactly what I needed. I found a remote campground near the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. Not a touristy spot, barely a dot on the map. Perfect. The first few days were bliss. I woke to birdsong, cooked over a fire, and wandered dense forests that swallowed the world whole. I let my thoughts stretch and drift. For once, I felt free. By the fourth day, I even considered extending my trip. But that's when I noticed it. Something was off. It was subtle at first. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived, yet at night, I started hearing things. The usual forest noises, the wind whispering through leaves, distant rustles, shifted into something heavier. Footsteps. Not steady like a person's, not the chaotic scurry of an animal. These were deliberate, quick, and stopped whenever I tried to listen. I dismissed it at first. It's the woods, I told myself. Wild animals, nothing more. But that night, as I sat by the fire, the feeling crept in, an itching awareness that something was watching me. The firelight felt feeble against the darkness pressing at the edge of the trees. My rifle lay beside me, untouched, but my hand kept drifting to it. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and retreated to the RV. For the first time, I locked the door. The mattress was stiff beneath me, my pulse a restless rhythm as I tried to rationalize the unease. Maybe it was a deer, a raccoon. Maybe... The knock came at 3 a.m., soft, almost hesitant, a tapping on the RV's side. My breath hitched. I reached for the rifle, gripping it tightly as my heart pounded. The knocks came again, harder this time. Deliberate. Testing. I switched on the lights and flung the door open, rifle raised. Nothing. The campsite was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But as I stepped out, flashlight sweeping the ground, I saw them. Tracks. Massive, far too large for any animal I knew. They resembled wolf prints, but grotesque, distorted, and impossibly large. The tracks circled the RV, vanishing into the woods. I cursed, backing toward the door, the rifle now a lifeline in my trembling hands. The next day, I searched the area, desperate for a logical explanation. Instead, I found claw marks etched into the trees. Deep, jagged wounds, some stretching 10 feet high. No bear could have done this. No bear moved like that. As dusk fell, a dense fog rolled in, suffocating the landscape. That night, I locked myself in the RV, every light blazing. I sat clutching the rifle, ears straining for any sound. The knocking returned. This time, it was on the roof. The RV shuddered as something heavy landed on top. My blood turned to ice. I didn't wait. I flung the door open, rifle ready. It was crouched on the roof, staring down at me. A hulking figure, covered in matted fur, its limbs impossibly long and sinewy. Its face, a grotesque mockery of a wolf and a man, sent a cold terror slicing through me. Its eyes gleamed with something ancient, something hungry. It leapt down before I could fire, landing with a thud that rattled my teeth. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, splitting the night, but the thing was already gone, moving with an inhuman speed into the shadowed forest. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the RV, rifle trained on the door, waiting for it to return. It didn't. At sunrise, I packed in a frenzy, leaving behind everything but the essentials. I didn't look back. Driving away, the memory of that thing played over and over in my mind. I'd seen it, felt its presence, the weight of its stare. This wasn't a cryptid or a ghost story to laugh off. The claw marks, the tracks, they were real. I reported to the local authorities. They dismissed it as a bear sighting, but I knew better. Bears don't knock on RVs. Bears don't crouch on roofs and stare you down with eyes that promise horrors you can't imagine. Weeks have passed, but I still see it in my dreams. The way it moved, the way it looked. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I'm a man of reason, grounded in logic and facts. My name is Wesley Granger, and I've been a history professor for over 2 decades. My students call me Old Wes, not just because of my graying hair, but because of my reputation as a rigid stickler for details. Adventure, to me, was confined to the dusty corners of ancient libraries, piecing together fragments of forgotten history. But after my wife passed away last year, the weight of silence became unbearable. Seeking solace, I did something uncharacteristically impulsive. I bought an RV. I thought the solitude of the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge, might clear my head. The mountains, with their ancient folds and shrouded peaks, felt timeless, like they harbored secrets older than humanity itself. On the third day of my journey, I found a secluded spot to camp. The narrow, winding road I'd followed seemed abandoned, its cracked asphalt consumed by creeping roots and moss. Tall pines loomed above, their dense canopy blotting out the sky. It was perfect, isolated, serene, untainted by the bustle of the world. The first day passed quietly. I hiked through the forest, photographing flora and cataloging species like some amateur naturalist. The crisp air, laced with the scent of pine and earth, was invigorating. By nightfall, I was cooking dinner by the RV, feeling at peace for the first time in years. Then I heard it. A sound, low, resonant, and unnatural, reverberated through the trees. It wasn't the call of any animal I knew. It seemed to vibrate in my chest, primal and strange, like something ancient stirring deep within the forest. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Mountains carry echoes. Sound travels in odd ways here, I told myself. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by exhaustion. Hours later, I woke abruptly to a thunderous crash outside. My heart pounded as I sat up in the darkness, ears straining. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing but an oppressive silence. Then came the scraping sound, metal dragged against stone, slow and deliberate. Summoning my courage, I peered through the RV window. At first, I saw nothing but the ghostly silhouettes of trees. Then something moved. It was massive, low to the ground, its shadow sliding between the trees. Its movements were wrong. Not the lumbering gait of a bear or the smooth stride of a predator, but something alien. When I shone my flashlight, the beam caught a glimpse. Matted fur, limbs that bent in unnatural ways, and a grotesque insect-like arch to its back. The light flickered, and it vanished into the shadows with a speed that defied belief. The next morning, I found deep gouges scored into the side of the RV and tufts of coarse, black fur caught in the door. One of the side mirrors dangled by a thread, shattered. Any rational person would have left immediately, but I convinced myself it was just a desperate animal, perhaps injured or disoriented. That night, I stayed awake, clutching a hunting knife. The forest pressed in on me, every creak of the RV and rustle outside amplified by my fear. Just past midnight, the noise returned, a low, guttural hum, followed by that ominous dragging. This time, I stepped outside. The air was suffocating, heavy with a stillness that felt alive. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping the tree line. Then I saw it. It crouched just beyond the reach of the light, its silhouette monstrous. Its head was low, almost touching the ground, and it was watching me. Its eyes, if they were eyes, gleamed faintly, reflecting the light like distant stars. I took a step back. It didn't move, it just stared, as if savoring the moment. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged. I stumbled, the flashlight flying from my hand. Pain seared through my arm as claws, too sharp and too precise to belong to any known creature, raked across my flesh. Desperation took over. I swung the knife blindly, feeling it connect with something solid. The creature let out a sound that still haunts my dreams, a guttural, mechanical screech that seemed to split the air and resonate inside my skull. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the RV. I made it inside, slamming the door and locking it with trembling hands. Blood dripped onto the floor as I backed away, my ears ringing from that terrible sound. I waited, heart racing, but the creature didn't return. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. The daylight revealed more damage to the RV. Deep gashes and claw marks crisscrossed the metal. When I reached the nearest town, I reported the attack. The authorities humored me, taking notes and collecting the fur I'd found, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. To this day, I don't know what it was that I encountered. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything that belongs in this world. I've spent my life studying the past, searching for logic and reason in history's mysteries. But this defies explanation. Sometimes I think about going back, about facing that thing again to prove to myself it was real. But the memory of its eyes, its impossible movements, and that otherworldly sound keeps me far from those mountains. Somewhere out there in the shadowed depths of the Appalachians, it waits. Ancient, hungry, watching. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as I parked my RV at the edge of the dense forest skirting the Blackwood River. It had been my sanctuary for years, a place as unchanging and eternal as the steady ripple of the water. Ever since I was a kid tagging along on my old man's fishing trips, Blackwood River had been my escape. Back then, it was the thrill of catching the biggest bass. Now, as a 34-year-old accountant drowning in a sea of spreadsheets, it was my refuge from the monotony of adult life. The forest was timeless, but something felt off that evening. A stillness. The usual chirps and rustles of life in the woods seemed muted, like the world was holding its breath. I dismissed the feeling and went about setting up camp. Routine was comforting, awning up, chairs out, a cold beer in hand. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, the shadows stretched long, clawing at the earth like dark fingers. That first night was calm, almost serene. I grilled some steaks, watched the stars bloom against the inky sky, and let the rhythmic murmur of the river lull me to sleep. By morning, the unease had melted away. I woke early, eager to fish. The river was generous, gifting me 2 fat trout by noon. Everything felt right again, like the forest was welcoming me back. But then I decided to explore. There was an old trail that tugged at my curiosity, a path I hadn't walked in years. Locals used to spin tales about that part of the woods. Strange lights, eerie sounds, shadows that didn't belong. I always chalked it up to campfire stories meant to spook kids. But as I ventured further, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches blocking out the sun. The usual chatter of wildlife vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. I came upon a clearing I didn't recognize, a perfect circle carved out of the woods, with a large flat stone at its center. The stone wasn't natural. Its surface was unnervingly smooth, and it emitted a faint hum when I touched it, like the vibration of a live wire. My gut churned with unease. Something was wrong with this place. I turned back, eager to return to the safety of my campsite. But the forest had other plans. The trail twisted in ways I didn't remember. Landmarks I swore I had passed on my way and were missing, replaced by unfamiliar trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became, until finally, mercifully, I stumbled back onto the riverbank. Relief flooded through me as I saw the familiar curve of the shore. Except, something was wrong. The fire I'd left smoldering was buried, as if someone or something had deliberately snuffed it out. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, just the cold pile of dirt and rocks where my fire had been. My skin prickled. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to an animal, but my gut told me otherwise. As I rinsed my face in the river, I saw it. A dark shape gliding just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a log, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. It circled the shore before vanishing into the depths. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after a long day. That night, the forest came alive. It started with a faint thud against the side of the RV, barely loud enough to stir me from sleep. Then came another, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound that made my skin crawl. Heart hammering, I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing, just shadows and silence. The sound moved. Above me, something heavy was crawling across the roof. I froze, my mind racing. It didn't sound like an animal, not a bear, not a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too calculating. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a tire iron from under the bed and flung the door open, the flashlight trembling in my hand. What I saw defied reason. A grotesque, twisted creature loomed on the roof. Its body was a nightmare, a patchwork of scales and matted fur, its limbs impossibly long, tipped with razor-sharp claws. Its face, God, its face was a gaping maw of jagged teeth, framed by cold, unfeeling eyes that locked onto mine. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat as the creature leapt to the ground with a sickening thud. It let out a guttural snarl, the sound vibrating in my chest like a drumbeat of terror. Before I could react, it lunged, its claws raking across my side. Pain exploded through me as I swung the tire iron blindly, landing a lucky blow that sent the creature reeling. I didn't wait to see if it recovered. I ran, crashing through the underbrush toward the river, the creature's snarls hot on my heels. The icy water bit at my skin as I plunged in, letting the current drag me away from the nightmare stalking the shore. When I finally pulled myself onto the opposite bank, gasping and trembling, the forest was silent again, but I could still feel it, its eyes watching from the shadows. I stumbled through the woods until I found a road, collapsing into the path of an oncoming car. The driver, pale and wide-eyed, helped me into the vehicle, my incoherent ramblings about monsters falling on skeptical ears. The next day, the police found the ruins of my campsite. The RV was shredded, claw marks gouged deep into the metal. The clearing and its strange stone were real, but there was no sign of the creature. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. I've always craved the kind of escape RV camping offers, a chance to break free from the relentless grind of my work as a software developer. I've been coding since I was a teenager, and after 20 years, burnout wasn't just a buzzword. It was my reality. Deadlines, meetings, the constant pressure to stay ahead of a field that never stops evolving. It all became too much. So I bought an old, dependable Winnebago and started taking weekend trips to the woods. No emails, no cell service, just the whisper of the trees and the solitude I'd longed for. My name's Leland Barlow, though most call me Lee. I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman, but there's a certain peace in nature that even I can appreciate. This time, I decided on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. It's a sprawling expanse of towering pines and winding trails, a sanctuary where the air feels cleaner and time slows down. I picked a secluded spot, far enough from the road to avoid any passing cars, but not so deep into the forest that I'd risk losing my way. It felt perfect. The first day unfolded as planned. I brewed coffee as the sun rose, spent hours lost in a book I'd been meaning to read, and took a leisurely hike along a nearby trail. By evening, the sun sank behind the tree line, painting the forest in shades of amber and shadow. I gathered wood, started a fire, and cooked up a simple meal. The crackling flames and the gentle rustle of leaves lulled me into a rare calm. It was close to midnight when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A low, deliberate thump echoed through the trees. It wasn't the random crash of a falling branch or the scamper of an animal. This was steady, rhythmic, like footsteps. My heart quickened as I strained to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move, the forest playing tricks with its echoes. Then, silence. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing more than a deer or a distant log shifting under its own weight. But just as I was settling back by the fire, it came again, closer this time. Thump. Thump, thump. Each step reverberated through the ground, too heavy to belong to any forest creature I knew. Gripping my flashlight, I swept its beam across the dense wall of trees. Shadows stretched and flickered, but nothing stirred. The thumping stopped, and the stillness that followed felt suffocating. Forcing myself to breathe, I doused the fire, retreated into the RV, and locked the door. Maybe it was a bear, I thought, my hands trembling. Just a bear. The next day was uneasy. I stayed near the RV, reading and cooking to distract myself, but every snapped twig or rustle of leaves made my nerves jump. By nightfall, the unease had grown into something darker, a feeling of being watched. And when the rhythmic thumping returned louder than before, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound circled the clearing, heavy and deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted me to know it was close. My flashlight revealed nothing but swaying branches and shifting shadows. The thumping grew louder, closer, until a massive shadow moved between the trees, too large and deliberate to be a bear. My breath caught. Then, a deafening crash. Something struck the side of the RV with enough force to send me sprawling. Metal groaned as claws tore at the thin walls. Heart hammering, I grabbed the rifle I kept for emergencies and bolted to the door, flinging it open in sheer desperation. The creature stood there, towering in the doorway. It was a grotesque blend of bear and nightmare. Matted fur stretched over a hulking frame, a snout too long, teeth too sharp. Its eyes gleamed with a cold intelligence that froze me in place. I fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. The creature barely flinched. It let out a guttural roar that made my blood run cold and lunged forward. I fired again, this time hitting its chest. It staggered, and I slammed the door shut, locking it as it howled in rage. But it didn't retreat. It kept pounding, tearing, trying to force its way inside. I fired blindly through the walls, each shot met with a sickening thud, until, finally, there was silence. Dawn broke before I dared to open the door. The creature lay sprawled across the clearing, its massive body riddled with bullet holes. Blood soaked the earth around it, but even in death, it looked otherworldly. This wasn't an animal from any biology book. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I didn't linger. Grabbing my things, I drove until the forest was a distant memory. I reported the incident to the authorities, who took the body and gave me a warning. Forget what you saw. It's classified. But I can't forget. No amount of miles between me and the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest can erase the memory of that night, or the haunting knowledge that something waits in those woods, watching, listening, waiting for someone like me to stray too far into its domain. And I know one thing for certain, I'll never set foot there again. They say people who run toward danger aren't wired right. Maybe they're right. My friends always joke that I had a death wish. I didn't think so, until Black Hollow. I'm Roland Morley, a geologist by trade, an adrenaline junkie by nature. I've spent my life chasing the untamed edges of the world, where beauty and brutality coexist. Storms, earthquakes, treacherous terrain, they don't frighten me. They call to me. But there are places, ancient places, where even the bravest should tread lightly. I learned that the hard way. It started with a whispered rumor, half forgotten over whiskey in a crumbling bar outside Knoxville. The bartender, a gaunt woman with eyes like storm clouds, leaned in close as if the walls themselves might be listening. Black Hollow, she said, the words trembling on her lips like a prayer unspoken. A cursed place, avoided even by the locals who didn't fear much of anything. That's how I knew I had to go. The road was less a road and more a jagged scar through the Appalachian wilderness. Trees, gnarled and ancient, loomed like skeletal sentinels on either side, their branches entwined as though conspiring against intruders. My RV groaned under the abuse of the uneven ground, and every jolt felt like a warning. No cell service, no backup, just me and whatever lay ahead. The clearing I found was picture perfect in its isolation. A narrow creek whispered nearby, its voice the only sound in a world unnervingly silent. No birds, no insects, just a thick, oppressive quiet that clung to the air like a second skin. I set up camp, brushed off the unease, and ventured into the forest with my gear. The trees here were unlike any I'd seen, monolithic, ancient, their bark twisting into grotesque shapes as if the forest itself had been frozen mid-scream. It was easy to get lost in their enormity. Too easy. Then I found the bones, half buried in the earth. At first glance, they seemed like the remains of a deer or bear. But as I knelt closer, a chill rippled through me. The skull, fractured and leering, was human. Bones lay scattered like a grotesque puzzle, splintered and gnawed. Something or someone had ripped this poor soul apart. I'm not one to scare easily, but this wasn't natural. It was deliberate, something primal and wrong. I snapped a few photos, the click of the camera absurdly loud in the unnatural silence, and left. I told myself I'd report it later, but deep down I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Some terrible, morbid curiosity rooted me there. I needed to know. That night, the storm came. Rain hammered against the RV, the wind a beast howling through the trees. I stayed inside, staring out into the blackness beyond the windows. But even the storm couldn't mask it. The sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. Not thunder, not the wind. Something alive. Watching. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the rain cold and unrelenting. The beam cut through the dark, but the forest remained impenetrable, its shadows shifting like restless phantoms. Then I saw it. A shape moved between the trees, too large to be a man, too fast to be a bear. Its movements were wrong, jerky, almost predatory. My breath hitched as it emerged from the shadows, hunched and monstrous, its skin glistening like wet stone. Its head was massive, jaws filled with teeth too sharp, too numerous. It wasn't hunting. It was playing. With me. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling as it approached, its steps slow, deliberate. My heart hammered as I realized the RV wouldn't protect me. Nothing would. Then it lunged. The impact rocked the RV, metal screaming under the assault. I fell into the mud, gasping as the creature clawed and slammed against the vehicle. It wasn't trying to get in, it was trying to destroy it, to corner me. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly into the storm, Branches tore at my skin, the ground sucking at my boots, but I didn't stop. The sound of its pursuit was everywhere, its guttural breathing a grim accompaniment to the drumbeat of my terror. I fell hard, my leg twisting as I crashed into the underbrush. Pain seared up my side, but I couldn't stop. It was on me. I felt its breath, hot and rancid, as its shadow loomed. I rolled over, expecting death, and instead met its eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They weren't even the eyes of something alive. Hollow, black pits stared down at me, endless and malevolent, a void that wanted to swallow me whole. It hesitated. That hesitation saved me. My hands found the flare gun in my jacket, and I fired. The forest exploded in crimson light as the flare struck its face. Its howl was pure agony, a sound that reverberated through my very bones. It staggered back, thrashing wildly as the light seared its flesh. Trees cracked and fell under its frenzied retreat. And then, silence. I didn't wait. Limping and half-blind with pain, I forced myself back to the RV, slammed the door, and huddled inside until dawn broke over the storm-ravaged forest. I left everything behind. The RV, my gear, all of it. When I reached the nearest town, I reported the bones to the authorities. They'll go to Black Hollow. They'll see the claw marks, the crushed metal, but they won't find it. They won't believe. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I won't be going back to Black Hollow. Not ever. I'm Lyle Drayton, and I used to be a long-haul trucker. What happened to me on October 4th, 1995, out in the mountains of Eastern Oregon, still haunts me. That day, I wasn't hauling cargo. I was driving my RV, heading toward Dead Horse Lake. I'd recently been laid off from a factory job in Wyoming and decided to live on the road for a while. I had nothing waiting for me back home anyway. That morning, I left a small town called Westgate, grabbing a black coffee at the diner before setting off. The sun barely brushed the ridgeline when I hit the road, fog creeping in from the valleys like a slow-moving tide. The air was crisp, the trees heavy with autumn leaves in golds and fiery reds. It was beautiful, but something about it all felt wrong. A weight hung in the air, thick and oppressive. I've always enjoyed solitude, but this wasn't the peaceful kind. It felt like eyes were on me, though every glance into my mirrors showed nothing. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But even then, I knew better. The road wound through dense forest, gravel crunching under my tires. Around noon, I pulled into a small clearing to stretch and make a sandwich. The silence hit me first. No birds, no wind in the leaves, just stillness. Heavy and unnatural. I stood outside the RV, looking down toward the lake shimmering through the trees below. It should have been serene, but the silence felt wrong. As I ate, memories of trucker tales flickered in my mind. Stories about people vanishing in the wilderness, mutilated animals, and shadows that didn't belong. I shook it off, but unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I got back in the RV and pressed on, planning to camp by the lake for the night. The deeper I drove into the valley, the thicker the fog grew. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision, twisted shapes I told myself were just gnarled trees. Then I saw it. A cabin, half hidden among the trees, weathered and forgotten. The wood was blackened in places, the roof sagging like a heavy sigh. I should have kept driving. God, I wish I had. But something about that cabin pulled at me, like it was daring me to stop. Against my better judgment, I parked and stepped out, leaving the RV idling behind me. The cabin was worse up close, its boarded windows and faded sign like an epitaph. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as I nudged it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with decay. Shadows crowded the corners, and broken furniture lay scattered, blanketed in dust. It was a corpse of a place, abandoned long ago, or so I thought. Then I heard it, a scratching sound. Faint at first, coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the scuttle of an animal, it was deliberate, slow, like something being dragged. My pulse thundered as I froze. The sound grew louder, closer, closer. Then it stopped. The floor creaked, the weight of something shifting. I didn't wait to see what it was. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I obeyed, bolting for the RV. I slammed the door and sped off, gravel flying as I tore down the road toward the lake. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I reached the lake by dusk, parking in the campsite. The fog thickened around me, swallowing the world. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat with a bottle of whiskey, trying to drown my nerves. The lake was eerily still, its surface like black glass. Around midnight, I started to doze in the driver's seat, shotgun within reach. Then came the knock. It was soft but deliberate, echoing in the silence. My eyes snapped open and my heart pounded. No one should have been out there. Another knock, heavier this time, made my blood run cold. I grabbed the shotgun, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I called. No answer, just silence. And then a third knock. Louder, more insistent. I flung the door open, shotgun raised, ready to fire. But the clearing was empty. The fog coiled thickly around the RV, then movement. A figure emerged, barely visible at the edge of the clearing. Tall, motionless, watching. "Who are you?" I shouted, stepping out with the shotgun aimed. The figure didn't move, didn't answer. The fog seemed to cling to it, her obscuring its face. My finger hovered on the trigger. Then it started walking toward me. Slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. "Stop!" I yelled, firing a warning shot into the dirt. The figure didn't flinch. It kept coming, its steps steady, unnerving. My heart hammered as I backed away, retreating toward the RV. It was on me in seconds. Hands outstretched, it lunged. I swung the shotgun, striking its side. It staggered, but came again, faster. I fired point blank. The blast echoed, and the figure collapsed. But when I approached, there was no blood, no body, just fog swirling where it had fallen. My mind reeled, every instinct screaming that this wasn't natural. I scrambled back into the RV, locking the doors and praying it wouldn't return. The night stretched endlessly, every creak and whisper of wind sending my nerves into a frenzy, but nothing else came. By dawn, the fog had lifted. The lake was calm, the world quiet once more. I packed up and left without looking back. I didn't tell anyone. I wouldn't have believed me either. But I'll never forget the figure in the fog. The way it moved, relentless, like it had nothing to lose. Whatever it was, I pray I never cross its path again. Charlie Trenton always hated feeling boxed in. Growing up in the suffocating grid of a Baltimore suburb, with its cookie-cutter houses and asphalt veins, had left him yearning for space. Open skies, boundless landscapes, silence. Those were his escapes. It was why every summer, without fail, he left behind his history classroom and took to the road in his aging RV. A rolling sanctuary, it carried him from the chaos of the city to the tranquil whispers of forgotten places. This year, he'd gone farther than usual, deep into the Appalachian wilderness, far off the main trails, where the air hummed with an ancient stillness. His RV rested in a secluded clearing near a murmuring stream, surrounded by towering trees. No cell service, no company, exactly what Charlie craved. The first night passed quietly. Crickets chirped, the stream gurgled, and the soft rustle of leaves lulled him to sleep. But the second night would be etched into his mind forever. It started subtly, a faint rustling in the underbrush. Charlie stirred in his sleeping bag, groggy but unconcerned. Wildlife was a given out here. He turned over and tried to drift back to sleep, but the sound grew louder. Closer. A deliberate crunching, as though something heavy was moving through the trees. His eyes snapped open. Propping himself on one elbow, he peered through the RV's small side window. Darkness, only the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in the night breeze. He told himself it was probably a raccoon, maybe a deer. But then came the thud, a sharp, jarring impact against the RV. Charlie froze. His heartbeat quickened. Grabbing the flashlight from beside his bed, he stepped outside, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The night air was cold, but sweat prickled the back of his neck as he scanned the perimeter. And then he saw it. A jagged, claw-like gouge sliced into the RV's metallic side, the bare metal glinting under his flashlight. It wasn't the kind of mark a branch or stray rock could make. It was deliberate, deep. A chill coursed through him. He swept the beam of light around the clearing, every shadow now alive with menace. And then he heard it. Thump! Thump! A rhythmic, deliberate sound coming from the trees, like something massive pacing. Watching. The flashlight trembled in his hand. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Charlie backed toward the RV, his every instinct screaming at him to run. But the moment his foot snapped a twig, the pacing stopped. A silence heavier than any he'd ever known enveloped the clearing. And then it exhaled. A deep, guttural sound. Air forced from lungs far larger than any he'd imagined. Whipping the flashlight toward the noise, he caught a fleeting glimpse, something tall, impossibly tall, standing just beyond the tree line. Dark fur glistened in the beam, and for a heartbeat, glowing eyes stared back at him. And then, it was gone, vanished into the shadows. Charlie didn't think. He bolted for the RV, slamming the door behind him and locking it. His chest heaved, every breath ragged and shallow. The knife he'd stashed in his pack felt pitifully small in his trembling hands. The night dragged on, oppressive and unrelenting. Charlie sat in the driver's seat, knife in hand, every muscle taut. Outside, the world was silent, but not the kind of peace he'd sought. This silence felt intentional, predatory. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, it brought no relief. Charlie stepped out cautiously, the knife still clutched tightly. As he surveyed the clearing, something caught his eye. A carcass, half buried in the dirt. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The body was grotesque, its proportions wrong, wolf-like but elongated. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its fur bristled like needles. Whatever had killed it had ripped it open savagely, leaving deep gashes that mirrored the ones on his RV. Before he could process the sight, the pacing sound returned. Thump! 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 It was closer now. Charlie turned, his stomach twisting into knots. From the trees, it emerged. 7 feet tall, its frame was gaunt yet powerful, its limbs unnaturally long. Fur as dark as night clung to its sinewy body, and its face, God, its face, was a nightmare given form. Elongated, almost canine, with eyes that burned like coals. It moved with an eerie grace, its head tilting as it regarded him. And then it smiled. The expression wasn't human. It wasn't anything. A sharp-toothed mockery of emotion that chilled Charlie to the bone. Instinct kicked in. He backed toward the RV, but the creature lunged, its claws swiping through the air inches from him. Adrenaline surged. Charlie threw himself inside, slamming the door shut just as the beast collided with the side of the RV, shaking the vehicle violently. A low clicking sound emanated from the creature as its claws raked the metal, trying to get in. "Come on," Charlie muttered, twisting the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. He floored it, the wheels spinning before finding traction. The RV lurched forward, and he didn't stop until he was back on a paved road far from the clearing. At the nearest gas station, Charlie stumbled out of the RV, his legs shaky. He stared at the deep gouges in the RV's side, a stark reminder that what had happened was no nightmare. When the cashier asked him if he was all right, he lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "Just something in the woods," he said, his voice hollow. "Nothing you'd believe." My name is Cole Danner. I'm a retired military sniper, and this story isn't one I've shared lightly. It happened on October 22nd, 1996. After years of combat and chaos, I took my RV on a solo trip through Yellowstone National Park. I needed the silence, raw, untouched wilderness to quiet the noise in my head. Wide open spaces, towering forests, and the kind of stillness that reminded you just how small you were in the grand scheme of things. The trip was meant to be simple. 3 days to clear my mind, recharge, and disconnect from the world. By the third night, I'd set up camp in a remote corner of the park near its northern boundary. No tourists, no distractions, just me and the night. The crackle of the fire was my only companion, and the stars above reflected in the glassy creek nearby. For a while, it was perfect, until it wasn't. It started subtly that afternoon. I'd been hiking, scouting for elk, but the forest was wrong, too quiet. As a hunter, you learn to listen, to feel the rhythm of the wild. But that day, the woods felt empty, lifeless. No birdsong, no rustling of squirrels, just an oppressive silence that clung to me like a second skin. Worse, I couldn't shake the sense I was being watched. By the time I returned to my RV, the feeling hadn't left. The wind, which had been steady all day, stopped abruptly, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it. A low, guttural growl from the tree line behind me. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, you name it. This wasn't any of those. The sound was too deep, too resonant, like it came from something far older and far worse. My instincts screamed at me to stay still. I didn't flinch, didn't turn my head. Whatever it was watching, waiting for me to react. Slowly, my hand crept toward my rifle. Then came the snap of a branch. I whipped around, rifle raised, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. 2 yellow orbs glowing faintly in the shadows. At first I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but the silhouette was wrong. It was too tall, easily 7 feet, and its limbs were grotesquely long, its movements unnaturally fluid. It stared at me, head cocked like it was studying me, deciding if I was worth the effort. I fired. The shot echoed through the woods, and the creature let out a scream. A bone-chilling sound that wasn't animal, wasn't human, but something in between. It vanished into the darkness, and I stood frozen, rifle still trained on the tree line. My heart was hammering, but fear wasn't part of the equation. Years of training had burned it out of me. This wasn't a fight I'd chosen, but it was one I'd finish. The tracks were easy to follow, deep and clawed, leading me up into the rocky ridges. The moonlight guided me as I moved silently through the woods, each step calculated. After an hour, I found it, a cave, its entrance hidden behind a thicket of brush. The air reeked of death, a wet, rotting stench that turned my stomach. Inside, the tunnel opened into a cavern, and I saw them. 5 of them, huddled around the mangled remains of a deer. But these weren't wolves. They were nightmares made flesh. Towering figures covered in matted fur, their faces elongated into snarling lupine maws. Their claws were knives, their teeth razors, and their eyes. Those same hellish yellow eyes glowed in the dimness. I didn't hesitate. I fired the first shot, and the bullet tore into one's back. It howled, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest, and turned on me, blood dripping from its jaws. The others followed suit, their growls reverberating through the cavern as they charged. Chaos erupted. I fired again, dropping one of them with a headshot, but the others were too fast. One slammed into me, knocking me to the ground, its claws raking across my chest. I rolled, narrowly avoiding another swipe, and drove my knife deep into its neck. It collapsed in a spray of blood, but the others were relentless. Another lunged. I swung my rifle like a club, cracking it across the creature's skull. It staggered, but didn't fall. My knife found its mark again, plunging into its chest. Hot blood spattered across my face as it let out a dying snarl. That left 2. The largest of them, easily 8 feet tall, hung back, watching with an eerie intelligence. It was the Alpha, I realized. The pack leader. It moved deliberately, stalking me as its remaining companions circled in the shadows. I reloaded, the sound of the chamber snapping shut echoing louder than I expected. The smaller one lunged. My shot dropped at midair, but the Alpha took the opportunity to strike. It hit me like a freight train, claws ripping into my shoulder and sending my rifle skittering across the stone floor. I grabbed a rock and smashed it into the creature's face, buying myself just enough time to grab my knife. The Alpha lunged again. This time I sidestepped, twisting as I drove the blade deep into its side. It let out a guttural snarl, its glowing eyes boring into mine. I pulled the knife free and plunged it into its chest. It fell back, weakened but still alive. I retrieved my rifle, raised it, and fired a final shot. The bullet hit dead center, and the beast crumpled, its body landing with a sickening thud. The cavern was silent now, save for my ragged breathing. Their massive forms lay scattered around me, lifeless. Whatever curse had spawned these creatures, it ended with them. I didn't linger. I hiked back to my RV, bloodied and bruised, and drove until I reached the safety of the main road. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A pack of werewolves in Yellowstone? They'd lock me up. But I know what I saw, and I know they won't be the last. If someone else stumbles upon them, I hope they're ready. I was, and I barely made it out alive. Behind the wheel of my rented RV, I had no reason to believe my long-anticipated solo trip into the Montana wilderness would be anything but a peaceful retreat. I'm Clark Jen, just a regular guy, or so I'd like to think. I've always preferred the company of towering trees and rushing rivers to the endless chatter of people. My work as a freelance software developer keeps me locked in a solitary rhythm. Days blurring into nights, deadlines piling up until the stress becomes unbearable. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a break from glowing screens and the suffocating hum of the city. By the time I reached Glacier National Park, the day was dissolving into twilight. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy aroma of pine. I found a small clearing, utterly secluded, with nothing but wilderness stretching for miles. It was perfect. I parked the RV, set up a simple camp, a folding chair, a small fire pit, a cold beer in hand, and sank into the quiet. The world seemed to exhale with me as the fire crackled softly, the only interruption to the stillness. But as night fell, the stillness began to feel unnatural. Too still. No breeze to rustle the branches, no chirping insects, only silence, vast and oppressive. I shook it off and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The thin walls of the vehicle did little to keep out the cold, and I cocooned myself in blankets, lulled by thoughts of the hike I'd planned for the morning. Just as sleep began to claim me, a sound shattered the silence, a faint but deliberate noise like something moving outside. At first, I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or a raccoon nosing around the campsite. But the sound grew heavier, more deliberate. Footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. The RV shuddered slightly, as though something had pressed its weight against it. Then came a dull, sickening thud at the door. My hand groped for the flashlight beside me, but I didn't dare turn it on. Instead, I crept to the small window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. At first, I saw nothing, just the whispering shadows of the trees and the silvery glint of the river in the moonlight. But then, at the edge of the tree line, it appeared. It stood unnaturally tall, at least 7 feet, its hunched frame draped in gray, leathery skin that seemed too tight over its skeletal body. No fur, no clothes, just skin. Its movements were deliberate, slow, as if it were scanning the area. It reminded me of an ape, but the way it moved wasn't natural, wasn't right. I ducked away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of crunching gravel circled the RV as it moved. Then, silence. I stayed frozen by the window, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, until exhaustion finally overcame me. When I woke, the morning light streamed weakly through the curtains. Stepping outside was a mistake. The fire pit had been overturned, and the ground near the RV was deeply disturbed. Indentations too large and too precise for an animal. The forest around me felt wrong, charged with an unshakable sense of being watched. Still, I convinced myself to stick to the plan. I had come here for peace, after all. With my backpack strapped tight, I set off on my hike, staying close to the river. For a while, the beauty of the wilderness almost distracted me. Almost. 2 hours in, the forest thickened, the canopy overhead choking out most of the daylight. That's when I saw them. Far ahead, on the crest of a hill, stood not one but 3 figures. Identical in their grotesque shapes, their movements eerily synchronized. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't wandering aimlessly. They were hunting. Below them, in a small clearing, was a family of campers. A man, a woman, and a child, completely unaware of the predators closing in. I should have shouted. I should have warned them, but my voice wouldn't come. Fear paralyzed me as I watched the creatures descend on their prey. It was over in seconds. The man went first. A guttural scream cut short as the lead creature tore into him with unnatural strength. Blood sprayed the trees as the others closed in on the woman and child. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. Branches whipped at my face, my lungs burned, and the screams behind me faded into the distance. By the time I reached the RV, I was shaking so violently I could barely get the door open. Once inside, I locked it, started the engine, and didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached a ranger station hours away. My frantic account of what I'd seen was met with skeptical glances and forced reassurances. They promised to check the area, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever those things were, they wouldn't leave evidence. I never went back to Glacier National Park. I left Montana that same day and haven't set foot in the wilderness since. People ask why, and I tell them the mountains weren't as peaceful as I'd hoped, but deep down, I know the truth. They're out there in the shadowed corners of the world, waiting, and they'll find you if you're not careful. It was supposed to be a simple escape, just me, my RV, and the open road. My name's Marcus Fowler, a mechanic from Walsenburg, Colorado. Engines have always been my refuge, their steady hum, a kind of music I could lose myself in. Lately, though, even that wasn't enough. The shop was struggling, and my ex-wife's remarriage last month felt like the final nail in the coffin of my resolve. I needed out. The mountains of Idaho promised solitude, and that was exactly what I craved. Isolation, quiet, and nothing to fix except a meal over an open fire. I found the perfect spot deep in the Salmon Chalice National Forest, miles from the nearest town. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you forget everything weighing you down. Towering pines surrounded the clearing where I parked, forming an almost cathedral-like stillness. It was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful, just the way I hoped. The forest was alive with the soft whispers of leaves, the occasional call of an owl, and the distant rush of a stream. I slept soundly, feeling more at peace than I had in months. The next day, I hiked for hours, losing myself in the maze of trails. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the world had forgotten this place existed. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, feeling lighter than I had in years. That lightness didn't last. It began with a smell, faint at first like a hint of something sour carried on the breeze. But by the time I reached the RV, the stench had grown unbearable, a pungent, gut-wrenching reek of decaying meat. I searched the area, thinking maybe an animal had died nearby, but found nothing. The smell clung to the air, sour and unrelenting, gnawing at the back of my mind. I told myself it was just the wilderness, a carcass hidden somewhere out of sight, and tried to shake the unease that had started to coil in my chest. As night fell, the forest changed. The usual symphony of wildlife faded, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a living thing pressing in around me. I tried to focus on the crackle of the campfire, the warmth of its light, but the shadows beyond seemed deeper, darker. Every now and then I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, the sensation of being watched gnawing at the edge of my sanity. I told myself I was imagining it, just nerves fraying in the quiet. But deep down I knew something was wrong. By midnight, the fire had burned low and the cold mountain air crept in. I locked the RV door, climbed into bed, and tried to convince myself everything was fine. But the unease stayed with me, refusing to let me sleep. I lay there, listening to the wind in the trees, every sound magnified by my racing heart. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thump like something heavy moving just outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate, circling the RV like a predator testing its prey. My hand closed around the hunting knife I kept by the bed as I forced myself to breathe. The RV shuddered suddenly, a heavy impact rocking it on its wheels. My heart pounded as I scrambled to the front, peering through the windshield. At first there was only darkness. Then something moved. A massive shape emerged from the shadows, hulking and unnatural. It was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur. It moved on 2 legs, but with an awkward, loping gait that was somehow worse than a human's or an animal's. It was staring at me. Even in the darkness, I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold. A deep, guttural snarl rumbled from its chest, vibrating through the RV walls. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window. The creature moved closer, circling the RV. I heard claws scraping against the metal, slow and deliberate, testing the thin barrier between us. The RV shuddered again, harder this time. The metal groaned under the force, the windows rattling. My panic boiled over. With trembling hands, I reached for the ignition and turned the key. The engine roared to life, startling the creature just enough to give me an opening. I slammed the RV into gear and tore out of the campsite, the heavy vehicle bouncing over the uneven terrain. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. The creature loping after me, faster than anything that size had a right to be. Its twisted, hulking form was illuminated by the taillights, its eyes black voids that reflected the red glow. It slammed into the RV again, denting the metal and nearly sending me off the road. I pushed the RV harder, weaving through the trees in a desperate attempt to reach the main road. The creature stayed with me, its snarls filling the air, its claws scraping the sides of the vehicle. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The snarls faded, and the crashing through the underbrush ceased. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of a small town at the base of the mountains. The gas station attendant gave me a wary look as I stumbled out to fill the tank. The RV was a mess, dented, scratched, the marks of claws gouged deep into the metal. I paid and left without a word, too shaken to explain. As I pulled onto the road, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a dark shape at the edge of the forest, watching. And then it was gone. I've never gone back to Idaho. The RV sits abandoned behind my shop, its scars a silent reminder of what happened. I don't talk about it, but some nights when the world is quiet, I hear it again, the faint thump of something heavy moving outside. and I know it's still out there, waiting. If you've ever lost someone close to you, you know the feeling, the hollow emptiness that lingers, a void that gnaws at your chest. I've carried that emptiness with me since my wife, Alara, passed away 2 years ago. We shared a good life, a quiet home in Virginia, and a love for the outdoors. We hiked, camped, fished. Those simple joys were ours. But after she was gone, those same places, those same activities felt like walking through a shadow of memory. Too heavy, too painful to bear. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep running from what we had shared. So I did what I thought would help. I bought an old RV, a 1987 Winnebago Chieftain, and set out on the road, camping in spots Alara and I had once dreamed of visiting. It wasn't about moving on. It was about moving through, pushing forward through the grief. One evening, I found myself driving towards a secluded patch of wilderness known as Whispering Pines, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd never heard of it before. I learned of it from a local man at a gas station who whispered that it was off the beaten path, a place forgotten by most. It sounded perfect. Whispering Pines was as serene as it was isolated. Towering trees rose like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of time. The air was crisp and clean, filling my lungs with a fleeting sense of freedom. I parked the RV in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pine trees. The forest was quiet, the earth carpeted with needles that smelled of resin and earth. The first day was uneventful. I set up a small campfire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for a deep, untroubled sleep. But by the second day, something was wrong. It started with sounds, distant at first, just the rustling of leaves or a branch snapping underfoot. But as the day wore on, the sounds grew closer, deliberate, calculated. No longer the random scurry of small creatures, but the slow, steady movements of something larger, something that was watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a deer or a bear. But the unease settled deep in my gut, something primal, impossible to ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the ground, the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I was sitting by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee, when I heard it, a low, rhythmic breathing, deep, heavy, and unmistakably close. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. There, just beyond the firelight, were two shapes, dark, slinking figures moving in unison through the night. As they came closer, the firelight caught them in full. They were huge, easily the size of wolves, but twisted, grotesque. Their bodies were unnaturally elongated, their fur matted and dark, as though it absorbed the very light around them. Their limbs stretched too long, each ending in claws that were blackened and gnarled like twisted talons. But it was their heads that froze me where I stood. Canine, yes, but stretched in ways that were wrong, with narrow, elongated snouts and mouths that seemed to twist into unnatural shapes, stretching too wide, too hungry. A cold sweat ran down my spine. My hand reached instinctively for the hunting knife at my belt. My gun was inside the RV, but I'd never make it there in time. The creatures paused at the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air. Their eyes, though hidden in the darkness, seemed to lock onto me. And then, without warning, they lunged. I bolted for the RV, my legs burning as I sprinted across the clearing, the sound of their claws tearing through the ground, their breathing growing louder, more frenzied. I slammed the door shut just as one of them collided with the side of the RV, the force nearly knocking me to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. I pressed my back to the door, breathing hard, knife still in hand. Then came the scratching, the horrible grating sound of claws scraping against metal, followed by low, guttural snarls. They were trying to get in. My heart pounded in my chest. I ran to the front of the RV, grabbed the shotgun from the overhead compartment, my hands trembling as I loaded it. Each second stretched into eternity as the scratching grew louder, more frantic, the RV shaking under the blows. And then, silence. I stood there, gasping, ears straining, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. No snarling, no scratching, only the crackling of the dying fire outside. I cautiously peered out the window. The clearing was empty. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows over the trees, but I knew better than to trust it. I kept the shotgun close, eyes darting from window to window, watching, waiting. The night dragged on, each creak of the RV making me jump, every rustle of leaves outside sending my heart racing. But the creatures didn't return. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I couldn't bear to stay another second. I packed up the RV in a frantic rush, my hands shaking as I loaded it, my mind replaying the horrors of the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, Harlan's Peak. It was small, sleepy, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. I parked the RV in a crowded lot near a diner and stumbled inside, drained, barely able to keep my eyes open. I ordered black coffee, trying to calm the storm in my head. That's when I noticed him, the sheriff. An older man, his face weathered and hard, his demeanor calm, steady. He sat at the counter, talking low to the waitress. Something about him seemed trustworthy, so I approached him and told him everything. The noises in the woods, the creatures, the attack. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he took a long sip of his coffee and finally spoke. "You're not the first to come out of Whispering Pines with a story like that," he said, his voice low. "Folks around here don't go near those woods anymore. Not since things started happening." "Things," I whispered, barely able to speak. He nodded, his eyes distant. "There's talk of creatures. Things that ain't natural, but nobody who's seen them ever lived to tell the tale." "What are they?" I asked, barely able to breathe. The sheriff shook his head. "No one knows. Some say they're wolves that have gone rabid. Others think they're something older, something that's been in those mountains long before we ever got here. But whatever they are, they're dangerous. You're lucky to be alive." I left Harlan's Peak that afternoon, the sheriff's words echoing in my mind. Whatever those creatures were, they were real. And they were out there, waiting, hidden in the depths of Whispering Pines. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the mountains in the rearview mirror. They loomed in the distance, dark and forbidding. I knew I'd never return to that place. But the memory of those twisted forms, the terror of their presence, would haunt me forever. At least I survived. My name is Ken Beasley, and I'm a wildlife photographer. This story begins on September 13th, 1996, deep in the remote Acha Mountains of Arkansas. My life had always been simple, a nomad chasing rare shots of elusive creatures in their natural habitats. My RV was my home, the wilderness my sanctuary. This trip, however, was different. It wasn't just about capturing a perfect moment, it was about chasing a legend. The Ozark Howler, a creature whispered about in hushed voices, part myth, part nightmare. They said it was the size of a bear, but not quite, its body hulking, its black fur matted and twisted. The horns, like those of a ram, curled grotesquely from its skull, framing its eyes. And those eyes, they burned red like embers, searing through the darkness. Some dismissed it as a malformed bear, others as something far older, far more dangerous. I was skeptical. But if I could get the shot, I could make history. So I drove my RV to the edge of the Acha National Forest, far from the last paved road. The forest towered over me like a cathedral of twisted oak and pine, their branches weaving together to block the sky. By day, the silence felt peaceful. By night, it turned oppressive, like the woods were alive and holding their breath. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I set up trail cameras, hiked miles of rugged terrain, and photographed everything from deer to wild turkeys. On the third night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. The first howl. Low. Guttural. The sound crept through the trees, reverberating like a chant from some dark ritual. It didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. Not coyote, not bobcat. My rational mind tried to explain it away, but deep down, something cold and primal began to stir in my chest. That night, I sat by my fire, flashlight in one hand, my camera in the other. The forest stretched out before me, bathed in moonlight. It should have been beautiful, but the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, as if the forest was closing in. Every snap of a twig sent adrenaline surging through my veins. Around midnight, the howls started again. Closer. I grabbed my camera, its night vision lens cutting through the shadows. I scanned the tree line, my breath fogging in the cool night air. Nothing moved. But I could feel it. Eyes watching me, studying me. I stayed up until dawn, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were huge, like a bear's, but the spacing was all wrong. Narrow, deliberate, almost calculated. Deep claw marks gouged into the earth, far deeper than any animal should have been able to make. My camera's shutter clicked as I took photo after photo, but no matter how many I snapped, my unease only grew. By the fourth day, the isolation had wormed its way into my mind. I hadn't slept, the howls keeping me awake night after night, my nerves frayed, and I decided to leave. As I packed up, a howl erupted from the trees, so loud, so close that it shook the ground beneath me. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half shrouded in shadow, it stood. The creature was massive, its hunched form dwarfing any bear I'd ever seen. Its black fur was matted with mud and something darker. The twisted horns jutting from its skull framed a face too angular, too wrong. But its eyes, they burned like twin coals, searing through the veil of shadows. For a moment, I was paralyzed, my mind grappling with the impossibility of what I was seeing. Then instinct took over. I reached into the RV for my rifle, fumbling as my hands trembled. The creature let out a snarl, a sound so deep it seemed to reverberate in my chest. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature's twisted form. It flinched but didn't fall. I fired again, hitting it square in the chest. It stumbled, letting out a roar that shook the air around me, but it didn't stop. It charged. Its claws swung wide, slicing through the air where I'd been standing just moments before. I dove, rolled, and fired again, the bullet grazing its shoulder. It shrieked, a sound so unearthly it made my ears ring, but it only seemed angrier. I backed toward the RV, the creature circling, its eyes never leaving mine. I was out of options, out of time. Then I remembered the flare gun. I scrambled into the RV, my heart hammering as the creature lunged. Its claws raked the side of the vehicle, carving deep gouges into the metal. I turned, raised the flare gun, and fired. The flare hit its mark, erupting in a blinding burst of light and searing heat. The creature howled, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream as the flare embedded itself in its face. The smell of burning fur filled the air as it thrashed, clawing at its head in agony. I didn't wait to see if it recovered. I slammed the RV's door shut, threw the gear into drive, and floored it. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I sped away, the creature's screams fading into the distance. I drove until I reached civilization, until the forest was a memory in my rearview mirror. Even now, I can still see its burning eyes, still hear its haunting howls. I never went back to the Aka Mountains. I don't know if the Ozark Howler is a legend, a mutant, or something else entirely. All I know is that it's out there, waiting, and I never want to see it again.